Old Yeller. Chapter 1. We called him Old Yeller. The name had sort of a double meaning. One part meant that his short hair was a dingy yellow, a color that we called yeller in those days. The other meant that when he opened his head, the sound he let out came closer to being a yell than a bark. I remember like yesterday how he strayed in out of nowhere to our log cabin on Birdsong Creek. He made me so mad at first that I wanted to kill him, and then later, when I had to kill him, it was like having to shoot one of my own folks. And that's how much I'd come to think of that big yeller dog. He came in the late 1860s, the best that I can remember. Anyway, it was the year that Pa and a bunch of the other Salt Lick settlers formed a pool herd of their little separate bunches of steers and then trailed them to the new cattle market at Abilene, Kansas. This was to get cash money, a thing that all Texans were short of in those days right after the Civil War. We lived then in a new country, and a good one. As Pa pointed out the day the men talked over making the drive, we had plenty of grass, wood, and water. We had wild game for killing, fertile ground for growing bread corn, and the Indians had been put onto reservations with the return of the U.S. soldiers to the Texas forts. In fact, Pa wound up, all we lack of having a tight tailholt on the world is a little cash money, and we can get that at Abilene. Well, the idea sounded good, but some of the men still hesitated. Abilene was better than 600 miles north of the Texas hill country that we lived in. It would take months for the men to make the drive and ride back home. And all the time the women folk and the children of Salt Licks would be left in a wild frontier settlement to make out the best that they could. Still, they needed money, and they realized that whatever a man does, he's bound to take some risks. So they talked it over with each other and with their women, and decided it was the thing to do. They told their folks what to do in case the Indians come off the reservations, or if the coons got to eating the corn, or the bears got to killing too many hogs. Then they gathered their cattle, burned a trail brand on their hips, and pulled out on the long trail to Kansas. I remember how it was the day that Pa left. I remember him standing in front of the cabin with his horse saddled, his gun in his scabbard, and his bedroll tied on back of the Kent. I remember how tall and straight and handsome he looked, with his high-crowned hat and his black mustache drooping in cow-horn curves past the corner of his mouth. And I remember how Ma was trying to keep from crying because he was leaving, and how little Arless, who was only 5 and didn't know much, wasn't trying to keep from crying at all. In fact, he was howling his head off. Not because Pa was leaving, but because he couldn't go as too. I wasn't about to cry. I was about 14 years old, pretty near a grown man. I stood back, and I didn't let on for a minute that I wanted to cry. Pa got through loving up Ma and little Arless and mounted his horse. I looked up at him. He motioned for me to come along. So I walked beside his horse down the trail that led under the big live oaks and past the spring. When he had gotten out of hearing of the house, Pa reached down and put a hand on my shoulder. "Now, Travis," he said, "you're getting to be a big boy, and while I'm gone, you'll need to be the man of the family. I want you to act like one. You take care of Ma and little Arless, and you look after the work, and don't wait around for your Ma to have to point it out what needs to be done. You think you can do that?" "Yes, sir," I said. "Now there's the cows to milk, and wood to cut, and young pigs to mark, and fresh meat to shoot. But mainly there's the corn patch. If you don't work it right, or if you let the vermins eat up the roasting ears, we'll be without bread corn for the winter." "Yes, sir," I said. All right, boy. I'll be seeing you this fall. I stood there and let him ride on. There wasn't any more to say. Suddenly I remembered, went running down the trail after him, calling for him to wait. He pulled up his horse and twisted around in the saddle. Yeah, boy, what is it? That horse, I said. What horse? He said, like he had never heard me mention it before. You mean you're wanting a horse? Now, Pa, I complained, you know I've been aching all over for a horse to ride. I've told you time and time again. I looked up to catch him grinning at me and felt foolish that I didn't realize he was teasing me. What you're needing worse than a horse is a good dog. Yes, sir, but a horse is what I'm wanting the worst, though. All right, he said. You act a man's part while I'm gone, and I'll see that you get a man's horse to ride when I sell the cattle. I think we can shake on that deal. He reached out his hand, and we shook. It was the first time I'd ever shaken hands like a man. It made me feel big and solemn and important in a way that I'd never felt before. I knew then that I could handle whatever needed being done while Pa was gone. I turned and started back up the trail toward the cabin. I guess maybe Pa was right. I guessed I could use a dog. All the other settlers had dogs. They were big, fierce cur dogs that the settlers used for catching hogs or driving cattle and fighting coons out of the cornfields. They kept them as watchdogs against the depredation of the lofer wolves, bears, and panthers and raiding Indians. There is no question about it. For the sort of country we lived in, a good dog around the place was worth sometimes more than 2 or 3 men. I knew this as well as anybody, because the summer before I had had a good dog. His name was Bell. He was nearly as old as I was. We had had him ever since I could remember. He had protected me from rattlesnakes and bad hogs while I was little. He'd hunt with me when I was bigger, and once he had dragged me out of Birdsong Creek when I was about to drown, and another time he had given warning in time to keep some raiding Comanches from stealing and eating our mule Jumper. And then he had to go act a fool and get himself killed. It was while Pa and I were cutting wild hay in a little patch of prairie back of the house. A big diamondback rattler struck at Pa, and Pa chopped his head off with one quick lick of his scythe. The head just dropped to the ground 3 or 4 feet away from the writhing body. It lay there with the ugly mouth opening and shutting, still trying to bite something. Well, as smart as Bell was, you'd have thought he had better sense than to go up and nuzzle that rattler's head, but he didn't, and a second later he was falling back, howling and slinging his own head till his ears popped, but it was too late then. That snake's mouth had snapped shut on his nose, driving the fangs in so deep that it was a full minute before he could sling the bloody head loose. He died that night, and I cried for a week. Pa tried to make me feel better by promising to get me another dog right away, but I wouldn't have it. It made me mad just to think about some other dog trying to take Bell's place. And I still felt the same way about it. All I wanted now was a horse. The trail I followed led along the bank of Birdsong Creek, through some bee myrtle brush. The bush was bloomin' white and smelled sweet. In the top of one a mockingbird was singing, and that made me recollect how Birdsong Creek had gotten its name. Maud named it when she and Pa came to settle. Ma told me about it. She said that she named it the first day that she and Pa got there, with Ma driving the oxen cart loaded with our house plunder, and with Pa driving the cows and the horses. They had meant to build closer to the other settlers over on Salt Branch, but they had camped there at the spring, and the bee myrtle had been bloomin' white that day, and it seems like every bush there was a mockingbird singing his fool head off. It was all so pretty and smelled so good, and the singing birds made such fine music that Ma just wouldn't go on. "We'll build right here," she had told Pa, and that's what they had done. Built themselves a home right there on Birdsong Creek, and fought off the Indians, and cleared a corn patch, and raised me and little Arless, and lost a little sister who died of a fever. Now it was my home too, and while Pa was gone, it was up to me to look after it. I came to our spring that was gushing clear cold water out of a split in a rock ledge, and the water poured into a little pothole about the size of a wagon bed, and in that pothole, up to his ears in the water, stood little Arless, right in our drinking water. So I says, "Arless, you get out of that water." Well, Arless, he just turned and stuck out his tongue at me. "I'll cut me a sprout," I warned. All he did was stick out his tongue at me again and splash water in my direction. So I fetched out my knife and I cut a green mesquite sprout, trimmed off all the leaves and thorns off, and then I headed for him. Well, Arless then saw that I meant business, and he come lunging out of that pool, knocking water all over his clothes laying on the bank. And he lit out for the house, running naked and screaming bloody murder. To listen to him, you'd have think the Comanches were lifting his scalp. Well, Ma heard him and came rushing out of the cabin, and she saw little Arless running naked. She saw me following him with a mesquite stick in one hand and his clothes in the other hand, and, well, she called out to me. "Travis," she said, "what on earth have you done to your little brother?" Well, I said, "Nothing yet, but if he don't keep out of our drinking water, I'm going to wear him to a frazzle." Well, that's what Pa always told little Arless when he caught him in the pool, and I figured if I had to take Pa's place, well, I just might as well talk like him. Ma stared at me for a minute, and I thought she was fixing to argue that I was getting too big for my britches. Lots of times she'd tell me that, but this time she didn't. She just smiled suddenly and grabbed little Arless by one ear and held on. He went to hollering and jumping up and down and trying to pull away, but she held on till I got there with his clothes, and she put them on him and told him, "Now look here, young squirrel, you better listen to your big brother Travis if you want to keep out of trouble." Then she made him go sit still a while in the dog run. The dog run was an open roofed space betwixt the two rooms of our log cabin. It was a good place to eat watermelons in the hot summer, or to sleep when the night breezes weren't strong enough to push through the cracks between the cabin logs. Sometimes we hung up fresh killed meat out there to cool down. Little Arless sat in the dog run and sulked while I packed water from the spring. I packed the water in a bucket that Pa had made out of the hide of a cow's leg. I poured the water into the ash hopper that stood beside the cabin. That was so the water could trickle down through the wood ashes and become lye water, and then later Ma would mix that lye water with hog fat and boil it in an iron pot when she wanted to make some soap. When I went to cut wood for Ma, though, little Arless left the dog run to come watch me work. Like always, he stood in exactly the right place for the chips from my axe to fly up and maybe knock his eyeballs out. I said, "You better skin out for that house, you little scamp." And he skinned out, too, just like I told him, without even sticking out his tongue at me this time. And he sat right there till Ma called us for dinner. After dinner, I didn't wait for Ma to tell me that I needed to finish running out the corn middles. I got right up from the table and went out and hooked Jumper to the double shovel. I started in plowing, where Pa had left off the day before. I figured that if I got an early start, I could finish the corn patch by sundown. Jumper was a dun mule with a narrow black strip running alongside his backbone between his mane and his tail. Pa had always called him Jumper because no one yet had ever built a fence that he couldn't jump over. Pa claimed Jumper could clear the moon if he took a notion just to see the other side of it. Jumper was a pretty good mule, though. He was gentle to ride, and you could pack a fresh meat on him, and he was willing about pulling a plow. Only sometimes when I plowed him, and he decided to quit when time would come, well, he would just stop working right then. Maybe we'd be out in the middle of the field when Jumper got the notion it was time for dinner, And right then he'd swing around and head for the cabin, dragging down corn with the plow and paying no mind whatever to my hauling back on the reins and hollering whoa. Late that evening, Jumper tried to pull that stunt on me again, but I was laying for him. With Pa gone, I knew I had to teach Jumper a good old lesson. I'd been plowing all afternoon, holding a green cedar club between the plow handles. I still lacked 3 or 4 corn rows before finishing when sundown would come, and Jumper decided it was quitting time. He let out a long bray and started wringing his tail, and he left the middle he was traveling in. Well, he struck out through the young corn, heading for the cabin, and I didn't even holler whoa at him. I just threw the looped reins over my shoulder and run right up beside him. Well, I drew back my green cedar club, and I whacked him so hard across the jawbone that I nearly dropped him in his tracks. Well, you never saw a worse surprised mule. He started to run, then just stood there and stared at me, like maybe he couldn't believe that I was man enough to give him a good clubbing that hard. Well, I drew back my club again, and I said, Jumper, if you don't get back there and finish this here plowing job, you're going to get more of the same. Do you understand? Well, I guess he understood all right. Anyhow, from then on, till we were through, he stayed right on the job. The only thing he did different from what he had been done with Pa was to travel with his head turned sideways, keeping an eye on every step of the way. When I finally got to the house, I found that Ma had done the milking, and she and little Arless were waiting on supper for me. And just like we generally waited for Pa when he came in late. I crawled into bed with little Arless that night, feeling pretty satisfied with myself. Our bed was a corn shuck mattress that laid over a couple squared up cowhides that had been laced together. The cowhides stood about 2 feet off the dirt floor, stretched tight inside a pole frame Pa had built in one corner of the room. I lay there, listening to the corn shucks squeak, when I breathed into the owls hooting in the timber along Birdsong Creek. I guessed I had made a good start. I had done my work without having been told, and I had taught little Arless and Jumper that I wasn't to be trifled with, and Ma could already see that I was man enough to wait supper on. Well, I guessed that I could handle things while Pa was gone just about as good as he could. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. It was the next morning when the big yeller dog came. I found him at daylight when Ma told me to step out to the dog run and cut down a side of meddling meat hanging in the pole rafters. The minute I opened the door and looked up, I saw the meat was gone. It had been tied to the rafters with bear grass braids that had been braided together to make a string. Now nothing was left hanging to the pole but the frazzled ends of the snapped blades. I looked down then, and at the same instant a dog rose up from where he had been curled up on the ground beside the barrel that held our cornmeal. He was a big, ugly, slick-haired yeller dog. One short ear had been chewed clean off, and his tail had been bobbed so close to his rump that there was hardly stump enough left to wag. But the most noticeable thing to me about him was how thin and starved-looking he was, all but his belly. His belly was swelled up as tight and round as a pumpkin. It wasn't hard to tell how come that belly was so full. All I had to do was look at that piece of curled-up hide that was laying in the dirt beside him, for all the meat was gnawed off. That side of meat had been a big one, but now there wasn't enough meat left on the rind to interest a pack rat. Well, to lose the only meat we had left from the last winter's hog butchering was bad enough, but what made me even madder was the way the dog acted. He didn't even have the manners to feel ashamed of what he had done. He rose to his feet, stretched and yawned, and then he come romping towards me, wiggling that stubby little tail and yelling, "Roar, roar, roar," like he belonged there and I was his best friend. "Why, you thieving rascal!" I shouted and kicked at him as hard as I could. He ducked just in time so that I missed him by a hair, but No one could have told I'd missed, after the way he fell over on the ground and lay there with his belly up and his four legs in the air, squalling and bellering at the top of his voice. From the racket he had made, you'd have thought I had a club and was breaking every bone in his body. Ma came running to stick her head through the door and was saying, "What on earth, Travis? Why, this old stray dog had come and ate all of our middling meat clean up," I said. So I aimed another kick at him, and he was quick, and he rolled out of reach again just in time, and then fell back to the ground and lay there yelling louder than ever. Well, then out come little Arless, and he was naked, like he always slept in the summer, and he was hollering, "A dog! A dog!" He ran past me and fell on the ground, petting on him till he quit howling, then he turned on me, fighting mad. "You quit kicking my dog!" he yelled fiercely. "You kick my dog and I'll wear you to a frazzle." The battling stick that Ma used to beat the dirt out of the clothes she was watching stood leaning against the wall. Well, now little Arliss grabbed it up in both hands and come after me a-swinging. It was such a surprising move little Arliss made fight at me that way that I just stood there with my mouth open and let him clout me a good one before I thought to move. Well, then Ma steps in and took the stick away from him. Well, Arliss turned on her, ready to fight with his bare fists. Then he decided against it and ran and put his arms around the big dog's neck, and he began to yelling, "He's my dog! You can't kick him! He's my dog!" The big dog was back up on his feet now, wagging his stubby tail and licking the tears off Arliss's face with his pink tongue. Ma laughed. "Well, Travis," she said, "it looks like we got us a dog." "But, Ma," I said, "you don't mean we'd keep an old ugly dog like that? One that'll come in and steal meat right out of the house?" "Well, maybe we can't keep him," Ma said. "Maybe he belongs to someone around here who wants him back." "Well, I don't think he belongs to anyone in the settlement. I know every dog at Salt Licks." "Well, then," Ma said, "if he is a stray, there's no reason why little Arliss can't claim him. And you'll have to admit, he is a smart dog. Mighty few dogs have sense enough to figure out a way to reach a side of meat hanging up that high. He must have climbed up on top of that barrel and jumped from there." Well, I went over and looked at that wooden lid on top of the meal barrel, and sure enough, in the thin film of dust there settled, there were some dog tracks. "Well, all right," I admitted. "He's a smart dog, but I still don't want him." "Now, Travis," Ma said, "you're not being fair. You had a dog when you was little, but Arliss, he never had one. He was too little for you to play with, and he gets lonely." I didn't say any more. When Ma got her mind set in a certain way, there was no use in arguing with her. But I didn't want that meat-thieving dog on the place, and I didn't aim to have him. I might have to put up with him for a day or so, but sooner or later I'd find a way to get rid of him. Ma must have guessed what was going on in my mind, for she kept handing me some sober looks all the time she was getting breakfast. She fed us cornmeal mush, cooked in a pot swung over the fireplace, and she sweetened it with a little wild honey that Pa and I had cut out of a bee tree last fall, and added cream skimmed off from last night's milk. It was good eating, but I had lost my appetite, being that I had my mind set upon fried middling meat to go with it. Ma waited till I was done, and then said, "Now, Travis, as soon as you've milked the cows, I think you ought to go get your gun and try and get us a fat young doe for meat. And while you're gone, I want you to do some thinking about what I said about little Arliss and that stray dog." End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. All right, I was more willing to go make a try for a fat doe. I was all generally more than willing to go hunting anyway. And while I was gone, I might do some thinking about little Arliss and that thieving strayed dog. But I didn't much think that my thinking would take the turn that Ma wanted me to. I went and milked the cows, and then brought the milk in for Ma to strain. I fetched my rifle down and went out to the lot and caught Jumper. I tied a rope around his neck, half-hitched a noose round his nose, and pitched the rest of the rope across his back. This was the rope I'd rein him with. Then I got me a second rope and tied it tight around his middle, just back of his withers. This second rope I'd use to tie my deer onto Jumper's back, if I got one, of course. Pa had shown me how to tie a deer's feet together and pack it home across my shoulder, and I'd done it. But to carry a deer very far like that was a sweat-popping job that, well, I'd rather just leave to Jumper. He was bigger and stronger. I mounted Jumper bareback and rode him around Birdsong Creek and across a rocky hogback ridge. I thought how fine it would be if I was sitting my own horse instead of this old mule. I rode down a long sweeping slope where a scattering of huge, ragged-topped live oaks stood about in grass so tall that it dragged under the underside of Jumper's belly. I rode to within a quarter of a mile to the Salt Licks and then left Jumper tied to a thicket and went on afoot. I couldn't take Jumper close to the licks for a couple of reasons. In the first place, he'd get to swishing his tail and stomping his feet at flies and maybe scare off my game. And on top of that, Jumper was gun-shy. You fire a gun close to Jumper, and he'd fall to stabs. He'd snort and wheel to run and fall back against the tie rope trying to break it loose. He'd bawl and paw the air and take on like he'd been shot. When it came to gunfire, Jumper didn't have any more sense than a red-hot ant in a hot skillet. It was a fine morning for hunting, with the air still and the rising sun shining bright on the tall green grass and the greener leaves of the timber. There wasn't much breeze, enough to blow and tell me the wind direction, so I licked one finger and held it up. And sure enough, the side next to me cooled first, and that meant that what little push there was in the air was away from me, towards the Salt Licks, which wouldn't do at all. No deer would come to the licks if he caught wind of me first. I did a little half circle round the licks till I got the breeze moving across them towards me, and then took cover under a wild grapevine that hung low out of the top of a gnarled old oak. I sat down with my back against the trunk of the tree. I sat with my legs crossed and my rifle cradled on my knees, and then I made myself as still as a tree. Pa had taught me that, way back when I was little, the same he had taught me to hunt downwind for my game. He always said, "It ain't your shape that catches a deer's eye, it's your moving. If a deer can't smell you and can't see you move, he won't never know that you're there." So I sat there, still as a stump, searching the clearings around the licks. The licks were scattered outcroppings of dark rocks with black streaks in them. The black streaks held the salt that Pa said had gotten mixed up with the rocks a jillion years ago. I don't know how he knew what had happened so far back, but the salt was there, and all the hogs and the cattle and wild animals in that part of the country came there to lick at it. One time, Pa said, when he and Ma had first settled there, they had run clean out of salt and had to beat up pieces of rock and boil them in water. Then they'd use the salty water to season their meat and the cornbread. Wild game generally came to the lick in the rocks in the early mornings or the late evenings, and those are the best times to come looking for meat. The killer animals like the bear and the panther and the bobcat knew this and came to the licks around the same time. Sometimes we'd get a shot at them, and I'd killed 2 bobcats and a wolf there while waiting for deer, and once Pa shot a big panther right after it had leapt on a mule colt and broke its neck with one slap of its heavy forepaw. I hoped I'd get a shot at a bear or a panther this morning. The only thing that showed up, however, was a little band of javelina hogs, and I knew better than to shoot them. You make a bad shot and wound one so that he went to squealing, and you had the whole bunch after you ready to eat you alive. They were small animals, but their tusks weren't as large as those of the range hogs we were running wild in the woods. They couldn't cut you as deep, but once those javelinas got after you, they'd keep after you for a lot longer of a time. Once, Jed Simpson's boy, Roscoe, shot into a bunch of javelina and they took after him. They treed him up a mesquite and kept him there from early morning till long after supper time. The mesquite was a small one, and they nearly chewed the trunk of it in two trying to get to him. After that, Roscoe was willing to let those javelinas alone. The javelinas moved away, and I saw some bobwhite quail feed into the opening around the licks, and then here came 3 cows with young calves and a roan bull. They stood and licked at the rocks. I watched them a while, then got to watching a couple squirrels playing on the top of a tree that was close to the one that I sat under. The squirrels were running and jumping and chattering and flashing their tails in the sunlight. One would run onto a tree branch and then take a flying leap to the next branch. Then there it would sit and fussing and waiting to see if the second one had the nerve to jump that far. And when the second squirrel did, the first one would get up in an excited chatter and make a run for a longer leap. And sure enough, after a while, the leader tried to jump a gap that was too wide. And he missed his branch, clawing at some leaves, and came tumbling down to the ground. The second squirrel went to dancing up and down on his branch then, chattering louder than ever. It was plain he was getting a big laugh of how that show-off squirrel had made such a fool of himself. The sight was so funny that I laughed myself, and that's where I made my mistake. Where the doe had come from, or how she ever got to where she was so close to me without her seeing her, I have no idea. It was like she suddenly lit out of the air like a buzzard, or risen right out of bare ground, right around those rocks. Anyways, there she stood, staring straight at me, sniffing and a-snorting and stomping her 4 feet against the ground. She couldn't have scented me, and I hadn't moved. But I laughed out loud at those little squirrels, and that sounded giving her warning. Well, I couldn't lift my gun then, with her staring straight at me. She'd see the motion and take a scare. And while Pa was a good enough shot to down a running deer, I'd never tried it and didn't much think I could do it. I figured it might be smarter to wait. Maybe she'd quit staring at me after a while and give me a chance to lift my gun. But I waited, and still she kept looking at me, trying to figure me out. Finally, she started coming towards me. She'd take one dancing step, and then another, and bob her head and flap her long ears about, and then she'd move towards me again. I didn't know what to do. It made me nervous, the way she kept coming at me. Sooner or later, she was bound to make out what I was, and then she'd whirl and be gone before I could even draw a bead upon her. She kept doing me this way till finally my heart was flopping around inside my chest like a catfish in a wet sack. I could feel my muscles tightening up all over. I knew then that I couldn't wait any longer. It was either shoot or bust wide open. So I whipped my gun up to my shoulder. And like I'd figure, she snorted and wheeled so fast that she was just a brown blur against my gun sights. I pressed the trigger, hoping my aim was good. After I fired, the black powder charge in my gun threw up such a thick fog of blue smoke that I couldn't see through it. I reloaded, and then leapt to my feet and went running through the smoke. What I saw when I came into the clear again made my heart drop down into my shoes. There went the frightened, snorting cattle, stampeding through the trees with their tails in the air like it was heel fly time. And right beside them went my doe, running all humped up with her white, pointed tail clamped tight against her rump. That meant that I'd hit her, but I hadn't made a killing shot. I didn't like that. I never minded killing for meat, and like Pa had told me, every creature has to kill to live, but to wound an animal was something else, especially one as pretty and harmless as a deer. It made me sick to think of a doe escaping, maybe to hurt for days before she finally died. I swung my gun up, hoping yet to get in a killing shot, but I couldn't fire on account of the cattle. They were too close to the deer. I might kill one of them by mistake. Then, suddenly, the doe did a surprising thing. Way down in the flat there, nearly out of sight, she ran head on into the trunk of a tree, like she was stone blind. I saw the flash of her light-colored belly as she went down, and I waited. She didn't get up. I tore out, running through the chin-tall grass as fast as I could give her. When finally I reached the place, all out of breath, I found her, laying dead, with a bullet hole through her middle, right where it had to have shattered the heart. Suddenly I wasn't sick any more. I felt big and strong and sure of myself. I hadn't made a bad shot. I hadn't caused an animal a lot of suffering. All I had done was get meat for the family, shooting it on the run, just like Pa did. I rode towards the cabin, sitting behind the gutted doe that I'd tied across Jumper's back. I rode feeling proud of myself as a hunter and a provider for the family. Making a killing shot like that on a moving animal made me feel bigger and even more important. Too big and important, I guess, to fuss with little Arless about that old yeller dog. I still didn't think much of the idea of keeping him, but I guess that when you're nearly a man, you have to learn to put up with a lot of aggravations like little old bitty kids. Well, let old Arless keep that thieving rascal. I guessed I could provide enough meat for him as well. And that's how I was feeling when I crossed Birdsong Creek and rode up to the spring under the trees below the house. Then suddenly I felt different. That's where I found little Arless in the pool again. In there with him was that big yeller dog. That dirty, stinking rascal romping around in our drinking water. "Arless!" I yelled at little Arless. "You get that nasty old dog out of the water." They hadn't seen me ride up, and I guess it was my sudden yell that surprised both of them so bad. Arless went tearing out of the pool on one side and the dog out the other. Arless was screaming his fool head off, and here comes that big dog with his wet fur rised up on the ridge of his backbone, baying like I was a panther. Well, I didn't give him a chance to get to me. I was too quick about jumping off the mule and grabbing up some rocks. I was lucky. The first rock I threw caught that big dog right betwixt the eyes, and I was throwing hard. He went down, yelling and a pitching and a wallering, and just as he came to his feet again, I caught him in the ribs with another. Well, that was too much for him. He turned tail then and took out for the house, squalling and bawling. But I wasn't the only good rock thrower in the family. Arless was only 5 years old, but I had spent a lot of time showing him how to pitch a rock, and now I wish I hadn't, because just about then a rock nearly tore my left ear off. I whirled around just barely in time to duck another that would have caught me right there square in the left eye. Well, I yelled, "Arless, you quit that!" But Arless wasn't listening. He was too scared and too mad. He bent over to pick up a rock big enough to brain me with if he was strong enough to throw it. And well, when you're 14 years old, you can't afford to mix in a rock fight with your 5-year-old brother. You can't do it, even when you're in the right. You just can't explain a thing like that to your folks. All they do is point out how much bigger you are and how unfair it is to your little brother. All I could do was turn tail like the yeller dog and head for the house, yelling for Mama. And right after me came little Arless, naked and running as fast as he could, doing his dead level best to get close enough to hit me with a rock that he was packing along. I outran him, of course, and then here comes Mama, running so fast with her long skirts a-swishing and calling out, "What on earth, boys?" Well, I hollered, "You better catch that Arless," as I ran past her, and she did. But little Arless was so mad that I thought for a second he was going to hit her with the rock before she could get it away from him. Well, it all wound up just like I figured. Ma switched little Arless for playing in the drinking water, and then she blessed me out good and proper for being so bossy with him, and the big yeller dog that had caused all the trouble, he got off scot-free. Didn't seem right or fair to me. How could I be the man of the family if nobody paid any attention to what I thought or said? I went and led Jumper up to the house. I hung the deer in the live oak tree that grew beside the house and began skinning it and cutting up the meat. I thought of the fine shot I'd made and knew it was worth bragging about to Ma, but what was the use? She wouldn't pay me any mind, not until I did something she thought I shouldn't have done. And then she'd treat me like I wasn't any older than little Arless. So I sulked and felt sorry for myself all the time I worked with the meat, and the more I thought about it, the madder I got at that big yeller dog. I hung the fresh cuts of venison up in the dog run, right where old Yeller had stolen the hog meat the night before. I did it for a couple reasons. To begin with, it was the handiest and the coolest place we had for hanging fresh meat. And on top of that, I was looking for a good excuse to get rid of that dog. I figured if he stole more of our meat, Ma would have to see that he was too sorry and no account to keep. But old Yeller, he was too smart for that. He'd gnawed around on some of the deer's leg bones that Ma threw away, but not once did he ever even act like he could smell that meat that we had hung up. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. A couple days later, I had another and better reason for wanting to get rid of old Yeller. That was when the two longhorn range bulls met at the house and pulled off their big fight. We heard the bulls while we were eating our dinner of cornbread, roasted venison, and green watercress gathered from below the spring. One bull came from off a high rocky ridge to the south of the cabin, and we could hear his angry rumbling as he moved down through the thickets of catclaw and scrub oak. Then he lifted his voice in a wild, brassy blare that set echoes clamoring in the draws and canyons for miles all around. "That old bull's talking fighting," I told Ma and little Arless. "He's bragging that he's the biggest and the toughest and the meanest. He's telling all the other bulls that if they got a lick of sense, they'll take cover when he's around." Almost before I got finished talking, we heard the second bull. He was over about the Salt Lick somewhere, and his bellering was just as loud and braggy as the first one. He was telling the first bull his talk was all bluff, and he was saying that he was the bull of the range and that he was the biggest and the meanest and the toughest. We sat and ate and listened to them, and we could tell by their rumbling and bawling that they were gradually working their way down through the brush to meet each other and getting madder by every minute. I always liked to see a fight between bulls or bears or wild boars or almost any other wild animal. And now I got so excited that I jumped up from the table and went to the door and stood listening. I'd made up my mind that if the bulls met and started a fight, I was going to go see it. There were still plenty of careless weeds and crabgrass that needed hoeing out of the corn, but I guessed I could let them go long enough to see a bullfight. Our cabin stood on a high knoll about 100 yards above the spring. Years ago, Pa had cleared out all the brush and trees from around it, leaving a couple live oaks near the house for shade. That was so that he could get a clear shot at any Comanche or Apache that was coming to scalp us. And while I stood there at the door, the first bull entered the clearing, right where Pa had one time shot a Comanche off his horse. He was a leggy, mustard-colored bull with black freckles speckling his jaws and the underside of his belly. He had one great horn that was set for hooking, while the other hung down past his jaw like a tallow candle that was drooping in the heat. He was what the Mexicans called a droop horn. He trotted out a little piece into the clearing, and then stopped to lower his head low. He went to snorting and shaking his horns and pawing at the dry dirt with his 4 feet, and he flung the dirt back over his neck and shoulders in great clouds of dust. I couldn't see the other bull yet, but I could tell by the sound of him that he was close and coming in at a trot. I hollered back to Ma and little Arless. "They're fixing to fight right here, where we can all see 'em." There was a split rail fence around our cabin, I ran out and climbed up and took a seat on the top rail. Ma and little Arless came and climbed up to sit beside me. And then from the other side of the clearing came the second bull. He was the red roan I had seen at the Salt Licks the day I had shot the doe. He wasn't as tall or long-legged as that droop-horned bull, but every bit as heavy and powerful. And while his horns were shorter, they were both curved right for hooking. Like the first bull, he came blaring out into the clearing, then stopped to snort and sling his wicked horns and paw up clouds of dust as well. And he made it plain that he wanted to fight just as bad as that first bull. About that time, from somewhere behind the cabin, came Old Yeller. He charged through the rails, bristled up, roaring almost as loud as the bulls. All their bellering and snorting and dust pawing sounded like a threat to him. He had come out to run them away from the house. I hollered at him, "Get back here, you rascal! You're fixing to spoil our show." Well, that stopped him, but he still wasn't satisfied. He kept baying the bulls till I throwed down and picked up a rock. Well, I didn't have to throw it, though. All I had to do was draw back like I was gonna. Well, that sent him flying back into the yard and around the corner of the cabin yelling like I'd murdered him. Well, that also put little Arless on the fight, and he started screaming at me. He tried to get down where he could pick up a rock as well, but Ma held on to him. "Hush now, baby," she said. "Travis wasn't going to hurt your doggy, just doesn't want him scaring off the bulls." Well, it took some talking, but she finally got little Arless's mind off hitting me with a rock. I climbed back up on the fence, and I told Ma that I was betting on the Shogo, the droopy-horned bull. She said she was betting her money on Roni because he had 2 fighting horns. We sat there and watched the bulls getting ready to fight and talking and laughing and having ourselves a real good time. We never once thought about being in any danger. When we learned differently, it was nearly too late. Suddenly, the droop-horned bull quit pawing the dirt and flung his tail into the air. "Look out! Here it comes!" I shouted. And sure enough, Shango the droopy-horned bull charged, pounding the hard pan with his feet and roaring his mightiest, and here came Roni to meet him, charging with his head low and his tail high up in the air. I let out an excited yell, and they met head-on with a loud crash of horns and a jar so solid that it seemed like I could feel it all clear up to the fence. Roni went down, and I yelled louder, thinking Shongo was winning. Well, a second later, though, Roni was back on his feet and charging through the dust and dirt. Their hooves were churned up, and he hit Shongo broadside. He slammed his short horns up to the hilt into the shoulder of the mustard-colored bull, and he drove against him so hard and fast that Shongo couldn't wheel away. All he could do was barely keep on his feet by giving ground. And here they came, straight for our rail fence. "Land sakes!" Ma cried out suddenly, leaping from the fence, dragging little Arless down after her. But I was too excited about the fight. I didn't see no danger at the time. I just sat astride that top rail when the struggling bulls crashed through the fence, splintering the posts and rails, and toppled me to the ground almost underneath them. I lunged to my feet, wild with scare, and got knocked flat onto my face in the dirt. Well, I thought for sure that I was a goner. The roaring of the bulls was right in my ears, and the hot, reeking scent of their blood was in my nose, and the bone-crushing weight of their hooves was stomping all around and over me, churning up such a fog of dust that I couldn't see a thing. Then suddenly Ma had me by the hand and was dragging me from out under, yelling in a scared voice, "Run, Travis, run!" Well, she didn't have to keep hollering at me. I was running as fast as I had ever hoped to run, and with her running faster and dragging me along by the hand, we scooted right through the open cabin door, just about a quick breath behind Roni slamming Shongo against the wall. They hit so hard that the whole cabin shook, and I saw great big chunks of dried mud chink and fall from betwixt the logs, and there, for a second, I thought Shongo was coming right through the door, right on top of us. but turning broadside like he was too big to shove through such a small opening, and then a second later he got off Rony's horn somehow and wheeled on after him. And there they went, down and alongside the cabin wall, roaring and stomping and slamming their heels against the logs. I looked at Ma and little Arless. Ma's face was white as a bedsheet, and for once little Arless was so scared he couldn't even scream, and suddenly I wasn't scared any more, I just got plain mad. I reached for a braided rawhide whip that hung on a coil on a wooden peg that was driven between the logs. Well, that scared Ma still worse. "Oh, no, Travis, don't go out there," she cried. "They're fixing to tear down the house, Ma," I said. "But they might run over you," Ma argued. The bulls crashed into the cabin again. They grunted and strained and roared, their horns and hooves clattering against the wall. I turned and headed for the door. Looked to me like they'd kill us all if they ever broke through one of those log walls. And Ma came running and grabbed me by the arm. "Call the dog. Put the dog after them." Well, that was a real good idea. I was half aggravated with myself because I hadn't thought of it, and here was a chance for that old yeller dog to pay back for all the trouble he had made around the place. I stuck my head out the door. The bulls had fought away from the house, and now they were busy tearing up more of the yard fence. I ducked out round the corner. I ran through the dog run towards the back of the house, calling, "Here, Yeller! Here! Come here, boy! Go get 'em! Sick 'em!" Old Yeller was back there all right, but he didn't come and he didn't sick 'em. He took one look at me running towards him with that bullwhip in my hand and knew I'd come to kill him. Well, he twitched his tail and let out on a yellin' run for the woods. If there has been any way I could have done it right then, I would have killed that fool dog. But there wasn't any time to be messing with that foolishness. I had to do something about those bulls. They were wrecking the place, and I had to stop it. Pa had left me to look after things while he was gone, and I wasn't about to let two mad bulls tear up everything that we owned and had. I ran up to the bulls and went to work on them with that whip. It was a heavy 16-footer, and I practiced with it quite a lot. I could crack that rawhide popper louder than a gunshot, and I could cut a branch as thick as my little finger off a green mesquite with it. But I couldn't stop those bulls from fighting. They were too mad. They were hurting too much already, and I might as well have been spitting on them. I yelled and I whipped them till I gave clear out. Still, they went right on with their roaring, bloody battle. Well, I guess they would have kept on fighting until they leveled the house to the ground if it hadn't been for a freak accident. We had a heavy two-wheeled Mexican cart that Pa used for hauling wood and hay, and it happened to be standing out front of the house, right where the ground broke away in a sharp slant towards the spring and creek. And it had just come to me that I could get my gun and shoot the bulls when Shongo crowded Rony up against the cart. He ran that long, single clear horn clear under Rony's belly. And then he gave a big heave that he lifted Rony's feet clear off the ground and rolled him in the air. A second later, Rony landed flat on his back inside the bed of that dump cart with all 4 feet sticking up to the air. Well, I thought his weight would break the cart to pieces, but I was wrong. The cart was stronger than I had thought. All the bull's weight did was tilt it so that the wheels started rolling, and away the cart went down the hill, carrying Rony with it. When that happened, Shongo was suddenly the silliest-looking bull you ever did see. He stood with his tail up and his head high, staring after the runaway cart. He couldn't for the life of him figure out what he had done with the roan bull. The rolling cart rattled and banged and craned its way down the slope till it was right beside the spring. Then one wheel struck a big boulder and bounced that side of the cart so high that it turned over and skidded to a stop. The roan bull spilled right into the creek. Water flew in all directions. Rony, he got his feet under him, and he scrambled up out of the hole. But I guess that cart ride and sudden wetting had taken all the fight out of him. Anyhow, he headed for the timber, running with his tail tucked. water streaming out of his hair, leaving a dark, wet trail in the dried dust to show just which way he had gone. Shongo saw Roni then. He snorted and went after him. But when he got to the cart, he slid to a sudden stop. The cart, laying on its side now, still had that top wheel spinning around and around and around. And Shongo had never seen anything like that. He stood and stared at the spinning wheel. He just couldn't understand it. He lifted his nose up to give it a sniff, and finally he reached out a long tongue to lick and taste it. Well, that was a big mistake. I guess the iron tire of the spinning wheel was roughed up pretty badly and maybe had some broken chips of broken rock and gravel stuck to it anyway. From the way that Shongo acted, he must have scraped all the hide off his tongue. Shongo bawled and went running backwards. He whirled away so fast that he lost his foot and then fell down. He came to his feet and took out in the opposite direction from the Rome Bowl. He ran, slinging his head around and flopping his long old tongue around, bawling like he was stuck in a bear trap. He ran with his tail clamped about as tight as the Rose Bowl was. It was enough to make you laugh your head off. The way both those bad bulls had gotten the wits scared clear out of him, each one thinking that he had lost the fight. But they sure had made a wreck of the yard fence. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. That little Arless, if he wasn't a mess. From the time he had grown up big enough to get out of the cabin, he had made a practice of trying to catch and keep every living thing that ran, flew, jumped, or crawled. Every night before Ma let him go to bed, she made Arless empty his pockets of whatever he had captured during the day. Generally, it'd be a tangled up mess of grasshoppers and worms and praying bugs and little rusty tree lizards. One time he brought in a horned toad that got so mad and he swelled out round and flat as a Mexican tortilla and bled out of the eyes. Sometimes it was stuffed like a young bird that had fallen out of a nest before it could fly, or a green speckled tree frog or a striped water snake. And once he turned out of his pocket a wadded up baby copperhead that nearly threw Ma into spasms. We never did figure out why the snake hadn't bit him, but Ma took no more chances on snakes. She switched Arless hard for catching that snake, and then she made me spend better than a week taking him out and teaching him how to throw rocks and kill snakes. Well, that was all right with little Arless. If Ma wanted him to kill his snakes first, he'd kill 'em, but that didn't keep him from sticking them in his pockets along with everything else he captured that day. The snakes might be stinking by the time Ma called on him to empty his pockets, but at least they'd be dead. And then, after the other dog came, little Arless started catching even bigger things, like cottontail rabbits and chaparral birds and a baby possum that slolled and lay like dead for the first several hours until he finally decided that Arless wasn't going to hurt him. Of course, it was Old Yeller that was doing the catching. He'd run the game down and then turn it over to little Arless, and then our little Arless would come in and tell Ma a big fib about how he caught it himself. I watched them one day when they caught a blue catfish out of Bird Song Creek. The fish had fed out into water so shallow that his top fin was sticking out, and about the time I saw it, Old Yeller and little Arless did too. They made a run for it, and the fish went scooting away towards deeper water, only Yeller was too fast for him. He pounced on the fish and shut his big mouth down on it and come romping onto the bank, where he dropped it in the grass and let her flop. And here little Arless fell on it like I guessed he'd been doing on everything else. The minute he got his hands on it, the fish finned him up good and he went to crying. But he wouldn't turn that darn fish loose. He just grabbed it up, went running and squallering towards the house where he gave the fish to Ma. His hands were all bloody by then, when the fish had finned him up. They swelled up and got mighty sore, and not even a mesquite thorn hurt as bad as a sharp fish fin when it come deep into your hand. But as soon as Ma had wrapped his hands up in a poultice of mashed up prickly pear root to draw out the poison, little Arless forgot all about his hurt. And that night, when we ate the fish for supper, he told the biggest windy I ever heard about how we dived way down deep into a deep old hole under the rocks and then dragged that fish out, nearly drowned before he could swim to the bank with it. But when I tried to tell Ma what really happened, she wouldn't let me. "Now this is Arless's story," she said. "You let him tell it the way he wants to." Well, I told Ma then. I said, "Ma, that old yeller dog is going to make the biggest liar in Texas out of little Arless." But Ma, she just laughed at me like she always laughed at little Arless's big windies after she'd gotten off where he couldn't hear her. She said for me to let little Arless alone. She said that if he ever told a bigger whopper than the ones I used to tell, she has yet to hear it. Well, I hushed up then. If Ma wanted little Arless to grow up to be the biggest liar in Texas, I guess it was none of my business. All of which, I figure, is what led up to little Arless's catching of the bear. I think Ma had let him tell so many a big yarn about catching live game that he begun to believe it himself. And when it happened, I was down at the crick a ways, splitting rails to fix up the yard fence where the bulls had torn her down. I'd been down there since dinner, working in a stand of tall, slim post oaks, and I'd chopped one down, trimmed off the branches as far as I wanted, and then cut away the top of the tree. After that, I'd start splitting the log. I'd split the log by driving steel wedges into the wood, and I'd start at the big end and hammer in a wedge with the backside of my axe. This would start a little split running lengthwise down the log. Then I'd take a second wedge and drive it into this split. This would split the log further along and at the same time loosen the first wedge, and then I'd knock the first wedge loose and move it up in front of the second. Driving one wedge ahead of the other like that, I could finally split a log in two halves. And then I'd go to work on the halves and splitting them apart. That way, from each log, I'd come out with 4 rails. Swinging that chopping axe was sure hard work. The sweat was pouring off me, and my back muscles ached. The axe got so heavy I could hardly swing it. My breath got harder and harder to breathe. An hour before sundown, I was worn down to a nub. It seemed like I couldn't hit another lick. Pa, he could have lasted till past sundown, but I didn't see how I could. I shouldered my axe and started towards the cabin, trying to think of some excuse to tell Mama to keep her from knowing that I was played clear out. And that's when I heard little Arless scream. Well, little Arless, he was a screamer by nature. He'd scream when he was happy and scream when he was mad, and scream a lot of times. He'd just scream to hear himself make a noise. Generally, we paid no mind to this screaming more than we did a gobble of a wild turkey, but this time was different. The second I heard his screaming, I felt my heart flop clear over. This time I knew that little Arless was in some real trouble. I tore up the trail leading towards the cabin. A minute before, I'd been so tuckered out with my rail splitting that I wouldn't have struck a trot, but now I raced through them tall trees at that creek bottom, covered in ground like a scared wolf. Little Arless let out a second scream, and when it came, it was louder and shriller and more frantic sounding than the first. And mixed with it was a whimpering, crying sound that I knew didn't come from him. It was a sound I had heard before, and seemed like I ought to know what it was, but right then I couldn't place it. And then from way off on one side came a sound that I'd recognize anywhere. It was the coughing roar of a charging bear. I had just heard it once before in my life, and that was the time that Ma had shot and wounded a hog-killing bear, and Pa had to finish it off with a knife to keep it from getting at her. My heart went to pushing up into my throat, nearly choking off my wind. I strained for every lick of speed that I could get out of my running legs, and I didn't know what sort of fix little Arless had gotten himself into, but I knew that it had to do with a mad bear, and that was more than enough. The way the late sun slanted through the trees had the trail all cross banded with streaks of bright light and dark shade. I ran through those bright and dark patches so fast that the change in light nearly blinded me. And then suddenly I ran out into the open where I could see ahead. And what I saw sent a chill clear down to the marrow of my bones. There was little Arless, down in that spring hole again. He was laying half in and half out of the water, holding on to the hind leg of a little black bear cub no bigger than a small coon. The bear cub was out on the bank a-whimpering and a-crying and clawing at the rocks with all three of his other feet, trying to pull away. But little Arless was holding on for all he was worth, scared now and screaming his fool head off, too scared to let go. How come that bear cub ever prowled close enough for little Arless to grab him, I could never figure, and why he didn't turn on him and bite loose I couldn't figure out either, unless he was just like little Arless, too scared to think. But all that didn't matter now. What mattered was that the bear's cub mama, and she had heard the cries of her baby and was coming to save him. She was coming so fast that she had the brush popping and breaking as she crashed through and over it, and I could see her black, heavy figure piled up down the slant on the far side of Birdsong Creek, and she was roaring mad and ready to kill. And worst of all, I could see that I'd never get there in time. Ma couldn't either. She'd heard Arless too, and here she come from the cabin, running down the slant towards the spring, screaming at Arless, telling him to turn that bear cub loose. But little Arless wouldn't do none of that. All he'd do was hang on to that hind leg and let out one shrill shriek after another as fast as he could suck in breath. And now the she-bear was charging across the shallows in the creek. She was knocking sheets of water high up into the bright sun, charging with her fur up and her long bared teeth, filling the canyon with that awful cough and roar. No matter how fast Mama ran or how fast I ran, the she-bear was going to get there first. I think I nearly went blind then, picturing what was going to happen to little Arless. I know that I opened my mouth to scream, and not a single peep come out. Just then, as the bear was lunging up the creek bank toward little Arless and her cub, a flash of yellow came streaking out of the brush. It was that big yeller dog. He was roaring like a mad bull. He wasn't 1/3 as big or heavy as that she-bear, but when he piled into her from one side, he rolled her clear off her feet, and they went down in a wild, roaring tangle of twisting bodies and scrambling feet and slashing fangs. And as I raced past them, I saw the bear lunge up to stand on her hind feet like a man while she clawed at the body of that yeller dog that was hanging at her throat. I didn't wait to see any more. Without even checking my stride, I ran in, jerked little Arless loose from the cub, and I grabbed him by the wrist and yanked him up out of the water and slung him towards Ma like he was a half-empty sack of corn, and I screamed at Ma, "Get him, Ma! Get him and run!" And then I swung my chopping axe high and wheeled, aiming to cave that she-bear's head in with the first lick. But I never did strike. I didn't need to. Old Yeller hadn't let that bear get close enough. He couldn't handle her, for she was too big and strong for that. She'd stand there on her hind feet, hunching over, taking a roaring swing at him with one of those big front claws, and she had slapped him head over heels. She had knocked him so far that it didn't look like he could possibly get back there before she charged again, but he always did. He'd hit the ground rolling, yelling his head off with the blow of the pain, but somehow he'd always roll to his feet, and here he'd come again, ready to tie into her with another round. I stood there with my axe raised, watching them for a long moment, and then from up towards the house I heard Ma calling, "Come away from there, Travis! Hurry! Run, son!" Well, that spooked me. Up till then, I'd been ready to tie into that bear myself, and now suddenly I was scared out of my wits again, and I went running for the cabin. But, like as it was, Old Yeller nearly beat me there. I didn't see it, of course, but Ma said that the minute Old Yeller saw that we were all in the clear and out of danger, he threw the fight to that she-bear and lit out for the house. The bear chased him for a little piece, but at the rate Old Yeller was leaving her behind, Mama said it looked like the bear was backing up. But if the big yeller dog was scared or hurt in any way when he came dashing into the house, he didn't show it. He sure didn't show it like we all did. Little Arless was hushing up his screaming, but he was trembling all over and clinging to Ma like he'd never let her go. And Ma was sitting in the middle of the floor, holding him up close and crying like she'd never stop. And me, I was close to crying myself. Old Yeller, though, all he did was come bounding in to jump on us and lick us in the face and bark so loud there inside the cabin the noise nearly made us deaf. The way he acted, you might have thought that the bear fight hadn't taken anything more than a rowdy romp that we'd all taken part of just for fun. End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Till little Arless got us mixed up in that bear fight, I guess I'd been looking on him about like most boys look on their little brothers. I liked him all right, but didn't have a lot of use for him. What with his always playing in our drinking water and in getting in the way of my chopping axe, and howling his fool head off and chucking me with rocks when he got mad, didn't seem to me like he was hardly worth the bother of putting up with. But that day when I saw him in the spring, so helpless against that angry she-bear, I learned different. I knew then that I loved him as much as I did Ma and Pa, and maybe in some ways even a little bit more. So it was only natural for me to come to love the dog that saved him. After that, I couldn't do enough for Old Yeller. What if he was a big, ugly, meat-stealing rascal? What if he did fall over and yell bloody murder every time I looked crossways at him? And what if he had run off when he ought to have helped with the fighting bulls? None of that made a lick of difference now. He pitched in and saved little Arless when I couldn't have possibly have done it, and that was enough for me. I petted him and made him over till he was wriggling all over to show how happy he was. I felt kind of mean about how I had treated him and did everything I could to let him know. I searched his feet and pulled out a long mesquite thorn that had become embedded between his toes. I held him down and had Ma help me with a stick of coal fire on it so that I could burn off 3 bloated ticks that I found on inside of his ears, and I washed him with lye soap and water and then rubbed salty bacon grease into his hair all over to rout out the fleas. And that night, after dark, when he sneaked into bed with me and little Arless, I let him sleep there and never said a word about it to Ma. I took him and little Arless squirrel hunting the next day. It was the first time I'd ever taken little Arless on any kind of hunt. He was such a noisy pest that I always figured he'd scare off most of the game. And as it turned out, he was just as noisy and pesky as I'd figured. He followed along, keeping quiet like I told him, till he saw himself a pretty little butterfly floating around in the air. And then he'd set up and yell about how you could hear it from a mile off and go off chasing after a butterfly. Of course, he couldn't catch it, but he would keep on yelling at me to come help him, and then he'd get mad because I wouldn't and yell even louder. Or maybe he'd stop and turn over a flat rock, and then he'd stand yelling at me to come back and look at all the yellow ants and centipedes and crickets and stinging scorpions that went scurrying away, hunting up new hiding spots. Once he got hung up in some briars and yelled till I came back and helped him out. Another time he fell down and struck his elbow on a rock and didn't say a word about it for several minutes until he saw that blood was seeping out of a cut in his arm. And then he stood and screamed like he was burnt with a hot iron. With that much racket going on, I knew we'd scared all the game clean out of the country. Which I guess we did. All but the squirrels. They took to the trees where they could hide from us, but I was lucky enough to see which tree one squirrel went up, so I put some of little Arless's racket to use. I sent him in a circle around the tree, beating on the grass and brushes with a stick while I stood a-waiting. And sure enough, the squirrel got to watching little Arless and forgot about me. He kept turning around and around the tree limb, keeping it betwixt him and little Arless, till he was on my side in plain sight. Well, I shot him out of the tree on the first shot. After that, old Yeller caught on to what game he was after. He went to work then, trailing and treeing the squirrels that little Arless was scaring up off the ground, and from then on, with Yeller to tree the squirrels and little Arless to turn them on the tree limbs, we had some pickings. Wasn't but a little bit till I'd shot 5, more than enough to make us a good squirrel fry for supper. A week later, old Yeller helped me catch a wild gobbler that I'd have lost without him. We'd gone up to the corn patch to pick up a bait of black-eyed peas. I was packing my gun, and just as we got up to the slab rock fence that Pa had built around the corn patch, I looked over and spotted that gobbler doing our pea picking for us. The pea pods were still green yet, and most of them no further along than snapping size. This made them hard for the gobbler to shell, but he was having his work at it, pecking and a-scratching so hard that he was raising a big old dust out in the field.
"Why, that old rascal," Ma said. "He's just clawing those pea vines all to pieces."
"Hush, Ma," I said. "Don't scare him." I lifted my gun, laid the barrel across the top of the rock fence. "I'll have him ready for the pot in a minute." It wasn't a long shot, and I had him sighted in dead to rights. I aimed to stick a bullet right where his wings hinged on his back, and I was holding my breath and all ready to squeeze off when little Arless, who had gotten behind, came running up.
"What you shooting at, Travis?"
he yelled at the top of his voice.
"What you shooting at?"
Well, that made me and the gobbler both jump. The gun fired, and I saw the gobbler go down, but for a second later he was up again, streaking through the tall corn, dragging a broken wing. For a second I was so mad at little Arless I could have wrung his neck like a frying chickens. I said,
"Arless, why didn't you keep your mouth shut? You made me lose that gobbler."
Well, little Arless didn't have sense enough to know what I was mad about, and right away he puckered up and went to crying and leaking tears all over the place. Some of them splattered clear down to his bare feet, making dark splotches in the dust that covered them. I always did say that when little Arless cried he could shed tears faster than any crier I ever saw.
"Wait a minute," Ma put in. "I don't think you've lost your gobbler yet. Looky yonder."
She pointed, and I looked, and there was old Yeller, jumping the rock fence and racing towards the pea patch. He ran up to where I had knocked that gobbler down, and he circled the place one time, smelling the ground and wiggling his stub tail, and then he took off through the corn the same way the gobbler went, yelling like I had beaten him with a stick. When he barked treed a couple minutes later, it was in the woods the other side of the corn patch. We went to him, and we found him, jumping at the gobbler that had run up a stooped old live oak and was perched there, panting, just a-waiting for me. So in spite of the fact that little Arless had caused me to make a bad shot, we had us a real sumptuous supper that night. Roast turkey with cornbread dressing and watercress and wild onions that little Arless and I found growing down in the crick next to the water. But when we tried to feed old Yeller some of the turkey on account of him having saved it for us, he wouldn't eat it. He'd lick the meat and wiggle his stub tail to show how grateful he was, but he didn't swallow more than a bite or two. That puzzled Ma and me, because when we remembered back, we realized that he hadn't been eating anything we'd fed him for the last several days. Yet he was fat, with hair as slick and shiny as a dog eating 3 square meals a day. Ma shook her head.
"If I didn't know better, I'd say that dog was sucking eggs, but I've got 3 hens a settin', and one with bitty chicks, and I'm getting more eggs from the rest of them than I've gotten since last fall, so he can't be robbing the nests."
Well, we wondered some about what Old Yeller was living on, but we didn't worry about it. That is, not until the day that Bud Searcy dropped by the cabin to see how we was making out. Bud Searcy was a red-faced man with a bulging middle, who liked to visit around the settlement and set and talk hard times and spit tobacco juice all over the place and wait for somebody to ask him for dinner. I never did have a lot of use for him, and my folks didn't really either. Ma said that he was shiftless. She said that was the reason the rest of the men folk left him at home to sort of look after the women folk and children while they were gone out on the cow drive. She said the men knew that if they took Bud Searcy along, they'd never get to Kansas before the steers were dead from old age. It would take Searcy that long to get through a visitin' and an eatin' with everyone between Salt Licks and Albany. But he did have a little white-haired granddaughter that I sort of liked. She was 11 and different from most girls. She'd hang around and watch what boys did, like showing how high they could climb a tree, or how far they could throw a rock, or how fast they could swim, or how good they could shoot. But she never wanted to mix in or try to take over and boss things. She just went along and watched and didn't say much. And the only thing I had against her was her eyes. They were big, solemn, brown eyes, and right pretty to look at. Only when she fixed them upon me, it always seemed that they looked clear through me and saw everything that I was thinking. That always made me sort of jumpy, so that, when I could, I never would look right straight at her. Her name was Lizabeth, and she came with her grandpa the day that he visited us. They came riding up on an old shad-bellied pony that didn't look like he had had a fill of corn in a coon's age. She rode behind her grandpa's saddle, holding to his belt on the back, and her white hair was all curly and rippling in the sun. Trotting behind them was a blue tick she-dog that I always figured was one of Belle's pups. Old Yeller went out to bathe them as they rode up, and I noticed right off he didn't go around about like he really meant business. His yellin' bay sounded a lot more like he was just barking because he figured that that's what we expected him to do. And the first time I hollered at him, telling him to dry up all that racket, he hushed on up, which kind of surprised me, as hard-headed as he generally was. By the time Ma had come to the door and told Searcy and Lizabeth to get down and come on right in, Old Yeller had started a romp with the blue tick she-dog. Lizabeth slipped to the ground, stood staring at me with those big solemn eyes, while her grandpa dismounted. Searcy told Ma that he believed he wouldn't come into the house. He said that as hot as the day was, he figured he'd like it better sitting in the dog run. So Ma had me bring out our 4 raw-hide bottom chairs, and Searcy picked the one that I always liked to sit in best. He got out a twist of tobacco, bit off a chew big enough to bulge his cheek, and went to chewing and talking and spitting juice right where we was all bound to step in and pack it all around on the bottoms of our feet. First thing he asked Ma if we were making out all right, and Ma told him that we were. Then he told her that he had gone to look after the other families while the men was gone, a might heavy responsibility that was nearly working him to death, but that he was glad to do it. He said for Ma to remember that if the least little thing went wrong, she was to get in touch with him right away, and Ma said that she would. Then he leaned back his chair against the cabin wall and went to telling about what all was going on around the settlement. He told about how the dry weather was, how he looked for all the corn crops to fail and the settlement folks to be scraping the bottoms of their meat barrels before next spring. He told how the cows were going dry, and the gardens they was also failing, and he told how Jed Simpson's boy Roscoe was sitting on a turkey roost waiting for a shot when a fox came right up and tried to put the jump on him, and Roscoe had to club it to death with his gun butt. This sure enough looked like a case of the hydrophobia to Circe, as anybody knew that no fox in his right mind was going to go jumping a hunter. Which reminded him of an uncle of his that got mad dog bit down in the pine woods of East Texas. This was way back when Circe was a little boy. As soon as the dog bit him, the man knew that he was bound to die, so he went and got a big log chain and tied one end round the bottom of a tree, and the other end to one of his legs. And right there he stayed till the sickness got him and he lost his mind. He was slobbering all at the mouth and a moaning and a screaming and ran at his wife and children, trying to catch them and bite them. Only, of course, the chain around his leg had held him back, which was the reason he chained himself to the tree in the first place, and right there, chained to that tree, he finally died, and they buried him under that same tree. But Circe sure hoped that we wouldn't have us an outbreak of hydrophobia in the Salt Licks and all die before the men got back from Kansas. Then he talked a while about a panther that had been caught and killed one of Joe Anston's colts and how the Anston boys had put their dogs on the trail. And they ran that panther into the cave, and Jeff Anston followed in where the dogs had more sense to go and got pretty badly panther mauled for his trouble. But he got himself the panther. Old Bud Sears he talked till dinner time, said not a word at all through dinner, and then went back to talking as quick as he swallered down the last bite. He told how some strange vermin that wasn't a coyote, possum, skunk, or coon had recently started robbing the settlement blind, or maybe it was somebody. Nobody could tell for sure. All they know was that they was losing meat out of their smokehouses, eggs out of their hen nests, and sometimes even whole pans of cornbread that women folk could set out to cool. Ike Fuller had been barbecuing some meat over an open pit and left it for a minute to go and get himself a drink of water, come back to find that 3 or 4 pounds chunks of beef ribs had disappeared like it had gone up in smoke. The Salt Lick folks were getting pretty riled about it, Circe said, and guessed that it would go hard with whomever was doing the raiding if they ever learned out what it was. Listening to this, I got myself an uneasy feeling. The feeling got worse a minute later when Elizabeth motioned me to follow her down to the spring. We walked clear down there, with Old Yeller and the blue tick dog following with us, before she finally looked at me and said, "It's him." "What do you mean?" I said. "I mean it's your big yeller dog," she said. "I saw him." "Do what?" I asked. "Steal that bunch of ribs. I saw him get a bunch of eggs, too, from one of our nests." I stopped then and looked straight at her, and she looked straight back at me, and I couldn't stand it, and I had to look down. "But I'm not going to tell," she said. I didn't believe her. "I bet you do," I said. "No, I won't," she said, shaking her head. "I wouldn't, even before I knew he was your dog." "Why?" "Because Miss Prissy's going to have pups." "Miss Prissy?" "That's the name of my dog. And she's going to have pups, and your dog's going to be their pa. And I wouldn't want their pa to get shot." Well, I stared at her again, and again I had to look down. I wanted to thank her, but I didn't know the right words, so I fished around in my pocket and brought out an Indian arrowhead I'd found the day before, and I gave that to her. She took it and stared at it for a little bit, with her eyes shining, and then shoved it down deep into a long pocket that she had sewn into her dress. "I won't never tell," she said, and then whirled, tore out for the house, running as fast as she could. I went down and sat by the spring for a while. It seemed like I liked Bud seriously a lot better than I ever had before, even if he did talk too much and spit tobacco juice all over the place, but I was still bothered. If Elizabeth had caught Old Yeller stealing stuff at the settlement, then somebody else might as well. And if they did, they were sure liable to shoot him. A family might put up with one of its own dogs stealing from them if he was a good dog, but for a dog that left home to steal from everybody else, well, I didn't see much chance for him if he ever got himself caught. After Bud Searcy had eaten a hearty supper and started talking a while longer, he finally rode off for home, with Elizabeth riding behind him. I went then and gathered the eggs and held 3 back. I called Old Yeller off from the house and broke the eggs on a flat rock right under his nose and tried to get him to eat 'em. But he wouldn't. He acted like he'd never heard that eggs were fit to eat. All he would do was stand there and wriggle his tail and try and lick me on the face. It made me mad. "You thieving rascal," I said. "I ought to get a club and break your back in 14 different places." But I didn't really mean it, and I didn't say it loud and ugly. I knew that if I did, he'd fall over and start yelling like he was dying, and then I'd be in a fight with little Arless again. "When they shoot you, I'm going to laugh," I told him, but I knew that I wouldn't. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. I did considerable thinking on what Elizabeth Searcy had told me about Old Yeller, and finally went and told Ma.
"Why, that old rogue," she said. "We'll have to try and figure some way to keep him from prowling. Everybody in the settlement will be mad at us if we don't."
"I think somebody'll shoot him," I said.
"Try tying him up," she said.
So I tried tying him, but we didn't have any baling wire in those days, and he could chew through anything else before you'd turn your back. I tried him with rope, and then with big, thick rawhide string that I cut from a cowhide that was laying across the top rail of the yard fence. It was the same thing in both cases. By the time we could get off to bed, he had done chewed them in two and then was gone.
"Well, let's try putting him in the corn crib,"
Ma said on the 3rd night, which was a good idea that might have worked if it hadn't been for little Arless. I took Old Yeller out and put him in the corn crib, and the second he heard the door shut on him, he set up to a yelling and a howling that brought little Arless on the run. Ma and I both tried to explain to him why we needed to shut the dog up, but little Arless was too mad to listen. You can't explain things very well to somebody who's screaming his head off and chucking you with rocks as fast as he can pick them up. So that didn't work neither.
"Well, it looks like we're stumped,"
Ma said. I thought for a minute and said,
"No, Ma, I believe we got one other chance. Try to shut him up in the same room with me and little Arless every night." "But he'll sleep in the bed with you boys," Ma said. "And the first thing you know, you'll both be scratching fleas and having mange and breaking out with ringworm."
"No, I'll put a cowhide on the floor and I'll have him sleep there," I said. So Ma agreed, and I spread a cowhide on the floor beside her bed, and we shut Old Yeller in and didn't have a bit more trouble. Of course, Old Yeller didn't sleep on the cowhide, and once a good while later, I did break out with a little ringworm under my left arm, but I rubbed it with turpentine just like Ma always did, and it soon went away. And after that, when we fed Old Yeller cornmeal mush or fresh meat, he ate it and did well on it, and never one more time bothered our chicken nests. About that time, too, the vermins got to pestering us so much that a lot of times Old Yeller and I were busy all night long. It was the coons mainly. The coons were ripening into roasting years now, and the coons would come at night and strip the shucks back with their little hands and gnaw the milky kernels right off the cob. And also the watermelons were beginning to turn red inside, and the skunks would come and open one little round hole in the rinds and reach in with their 4 feet and dig out the juicy insides to eat. Sometimes the coyotes would come, eat watermelons too, and now and then a deer would jump into the field and eat corn, melons, and peas. So, Old Yeller and I, we took to sleeping in the corn patch every night. We slept on the cowhide that Yeller never would sleep on in the house, and that is, when we did get any sleep. Most of the night we'd be up fighting coons. We slept out in the middle of the patch, where Yeller could catch scent of a coon clear to the fence on either side. We'd lay there on the cowhide, looking up at the stars, listening to the warm night breeze rustling the corn blades. Sometimes I'd wonder what the stars were and what kept them hanging up there so high and bright, and if Pa, way off yonder up there in Kansas, could see the same stars that I could see. I was getting mighty lonesome to see Pa. With the help of Old Yeller, I was taking care of things all right, but I was sure beginning to wish that he'd come back home. Then I'd think a while about the time when I'd get big enough to go off on a cow drive my own self, riding my own horse and seeing all the big new country of plains and cricks and rivers and mountains and timbers and new towns and Indian camps. Then, finally, about the time I started drifting off to sleep, I'd hear Old Yeller rise to his feet and go padding off through the corn. A minute later, his yelling bay would lift off some part of the corn patch, and I'd hear the fighting squall of some coon that was caught stealing corn. Then I'd jump to my feet and go running through the corn, shouting encouragement to Old Yeller. "You get him, Yeller! Tear him up!" I'd holler. And that's what Old Yeller would be trying to do, but a boar coon ain't easy thing to tear up. For one size, he'll fight you from sundown to sunup. He's not big for size, but the longer you fight him, the bigger he seems to get. He fights you with all 4 teeth and every tooth in his head, and enough courage for an animal that was 5 times his size. On top of that, he's fighting inside a thick hide that fills a dog's mouth like a wad of loose sacking. The dog has a hard time ever really trying to bite him. He just squirms and twists around inside that hide and won't quit fighting even after the dog's got enough and ready to throw the fight to him. Plenty of times Pa and I seen a boar coon whip Bell and run him off, then turn on us and chase us clean out of the cornfield. It was easy for me to go running through the dark cornfields yelling for Old Yeller to tear up the thieving rascal, but it wasn't easy for Old Yeller to do. He'd be yelling and the coon would be squalling, and they'd go wallering and clawing and thrashing through the corn and popping the stalks as they broke them off, making such an uproar in the night that it sounded like murder. But generally, when the fight was all over, the coon went one way and the Old Yeller he went the other. Both of them pretty much well satisfied to call it quits. We didn't get much sleep of a night while all this was going on, but we had us a good time and saved the corn from the coons. The only real bad part of it was the skunks. What with all the racket we made coon fighting, the scoons didn't come too often, but when one did come, we were in a mess. Old Yeller, he could handle a skunk easy enough. All he had to do was rush in, grab it by the head, and give it a good shaking. That would break the skunk's neck, but it wouldn't be the end of all the trouble, because not even a hoot owl can kill a skunk without getting sprayed with his scent. And skunk scent is a smell that just won't quit. After every skunk killing, Old Yeller would get so sick he could hardly stand it. He'd start a snorting and a drooling and slobbering and often vomit. He'd roll and waller in the dirt, go dragging his body through tall weeds, trying to get the scent off, but he couldn't. Then finally he'd give up and come and lay down on the cowhide with me. And of course he'd smell so bad that I couldn't stand him and have to go off and try and sleep somewhere else. And then he'd follow me and have his feelings all hurt because I wouldn't let him sleep with me. Pa always said that breathing skunk scent was the best way in the world to cure a head cold, but this was summertime, when Old Yeller and I didn't have head colds. We would just as soon leave the skunks stayed out of the watermelon and leave us alone. Working there night after night, guarding our precious bread corn from vermin, I came to see what I would have been up against if I had to do it without the help of Old Yeller. By myself, I'd have been run to death and still probably wouldn't have had saved the corn. And also, look at all the fun I would have missed out if I was alone, and how lonesome I would have been. I had to admit Pa had been right when he told me how bad I needed a dog. I saw that even clearly now when the spotted heifer had her first calf. Our milk cows were all old-time longhorn cattle and didn't give a whole lot of milk. It was real hard to find one that would give more than her calf would take. What we generally had to do was milk 4 or 5 or 6 cows to get enough milk just for the family. But we had one crumpled horn cow named Rose that gave a lot of milk, only she was getting old, and Ma kept hoping that each of her heifer calves would turn out to be as good a milker as Rose. Ma had tried 2 or 3, but none of them proved to be any good, and then along came this spotted one that was just as raw bone and ugly enough to make a good milk cow. She had the bag for it, too, and Ma was certain this time she'd get a milk cow that would replace Rose. The only trouble was this heifer Spot, as we called her, had been snaky wild from the day she was born, and tried to drive her with the other cattle, and she'd run off and hide. Hem her into a corner and try and get your hands upon her, and she'd turn on you and make fight. Ma had been trying all along to get Spot gentled before she had her first calf, but it was of no use. Spot didn't want to be friends with anybody. We knew she was going to give us a pile of trouble when we set out to milking her. I failed to find Spot with the rest of our milk cows one evening, and when I went to drive them up the next day, she was still gone.
It's time for her to calve, and I bet she's got one,
Ma said. So the next morning, I went further back into the hills and searched all over. I finally came upon her, holed up in a dense thicket of bee myrtle close to a little seeping spring. I got a brief glimpse of a wobbly, long-legged calf before Spot snorted, and then took after me. She ran me clear to the top of the next high ridge before she turned back. I made another try. I got to the edge of the thicket and picked me up some rocks, and I went to hollering and chucking into the brush, trying to scare her and the calf out. Well, I got her out all right, but she wasn't scared. She come straight at me with her head lowered and bawling with her threats as she came along. And I had to turn tail a second time, and again she chased me clear to the top of that ridge. I tried one more time, and then went back to the house and got Old Yeller. I didn't know if he knew anything about driving cattle or not, but I was willing to bet that he could keep her from chasing me. And he did. I went up to the edge of the thicket and started a-hollering and chucking rocks into it, and here come the heifer. Madder than ever, it looked like. Well, I yelled at Old Yeller. I said, "Get her, Yeller, get her!" And I hollered, and Yeller got her. He pulled the neatest trick I ever did see a dog pull on a cow brute. Only I didn't see it the first time. I was getting away from there too fast. I'd stumbled and fallen to my knees when I turned to run from Spot's charge, and she was too close behind me to be looking back and watching what Old Yeller was doing. I just heard the scared bawl she let out and the crash of the brush as Old Yeller rolled her into it. I ran a piece further and then looked back. The heifer was scrambling to her feet in a cloud of dust and looking like she didn't know any more about what had happened than I did. Then she caught sight of Old Yeller, and she snorted, stuck her tail in the air, and made after him. Yeller ran like he was scared to death, and then cut back around a thicket. A second later, he was coming in behind Spot, and without making a sound, he ran up beside her, made his leap, and set his teeth into her nose. I guess it was the weight of him that did it. I saw him do it a lot of times later, but I never did quite understand how. Anyway, he just set his teeth into her nose, doubled himself into a tight ball, and swung on. Well, that turned the charging heifer a flip, Her heels went straight up in the air over her head, and she landed flat on her back with all 4 feet sticking up. And she hit the ground so hard it sounded like she ought to bust wide open. I guess she felt that way about it as well. Anyway, after taking that second fall, she didn't have much fight left in her. She just scrambled to her feet and went trotting back into the thicket, lowing for her calf. I followed her, with Old Yeller beside me, and we drove her out across the hills to the cow lot. Not one time did she turn on us again. She did try and run off a couple times, but all I had to do was send Old Yeller in to head her off, and the second she caught sight of him, she couldn't turn fast enough to get headed back in the right direction. It was the same when we got her into the cow pen. Her bag was all in a strut with milk that the calf couldn't hold, and Ma said we needed to get that milk out. She came with a bucket, and I took it, knowing I had me a big kickin' fight on my hands if I ever hoped to get any milk. The kickin' fightin' started. The first time I touched Spot's bag, she reached out with a flying hind foot, aiming to kick my fool head off and coming close to doing it. Then she wheeled on me and put me on the top of the rail fence as quick as a squirrel had ever made it. Ma shook her head. I was hoping she wouldn't be that way. I always hate to have to tie up a heifer to break her for milking, but I guess there's no other way for this one. I thought of all the trouble it would be having to tie up that Spot heifer, head and feet, twice a day, every day for maybe a month or more. I looked at Old Yeller, standing just outside the pen. Yeller, come on in here, I said. Yeller came bounding through the rails. Why, son, you can't teach a heifer to stand with a dog in the pen, especially one with a young calf. She'll be fighting him all the time, thinking he's a wolf or something trying to get her calf. I laughed. Well, maybe it won't work, but I bet you one thing, she won't be fighting Old Yeller. And she didn't either. She lowered her horns, rolled her eyes as I brought Old Yeller up to her. Now, Yeller, you stand here and you watch her. Old Yeller seemed to know just what I wanted. He walked right up to where he could almost touch his nose to hers, and stood there, wagging his stumpy tail. And she didn't charge him, or run from him. All she did was stand there and sort of tremble. I went back, milked out her strutting bag, and she didn't offer to kick me one more time, just flinched and drew back a little when I first touched her. Well, that sure beats all. Why, at that rate, we'll have her broke to milk in a week's time. And Ma was right. Within 3 days after we started, I could drive Spot into the pen and go right up and milk her, and all she'd do was stand there and stare at Old Yeller. And by the end of the second week, she was standing and belching and chewing her cud, the gentlest cow I ever did milk. After all that, I guess you could see why I nearly died when a man rode up one day and claimed Old Yeller. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. The man's name was Bern Sanderson. He was a young man who rode a good horse, and was mighty nice and polite about taking his hat off to Mama when he dismounted in front of our cabin. He told Ma who he was. He said he was a newcomer to the Salt Licks. He said that he'd come down from San Antonio way with a little bunch of cattle that he was grazing over in Devil River country. He said he couldn't afford to hire riders, so he brought along a couple dogs to help him herd his cattle. One of these dogs, the best one, had disappeared. He'd inquired about it around at Salt Licks, and Bud Searcy had told him that we had the dog. A big yellow dog? Ma asked, looking sober and worried. Yes'm, the man said, and then added with a grin, and the worst egg sucker and camp robber you ever laid eyes on. Still, you blind the old devil will, but there's never been a better cow dog born. Ma turned to me. Son, call Old Yeller. she said. I stood frozen in my tracks. I was so full of panic that I couldn't think or move.
Go on, son, Ma urged. I think he and little Arless must be playing down about the crick somewhere. But, Ma, we can't do without Old Yeller. He's Travis.
Ma's voice was too sharp. I knew I was whipped. I turned, went down to the creek, so mad at Bud Searcy that I couldn't see straight. Why couldn't he keep his blabbermouth shut?
Come on up to the house,
I told little Arliss. I guess the way I said it let him know that something real bad was happening. He didn't argue, or stick out his tongue, or anything. He just got out of the water and followed me back to the house and embarrassed Mama and the young man nearly to death because he was packing his clothes in one hand instead of wearing them. I guess Burns Sanderson had got an idea of how much we thought of Old Yeller, or maybe Ma had told some things about the dog while I was gone to the crick. Anyway, he acted uncomfortable about taking the dog off. Now, Miss Coots, he said to Ma, your man is gone and you and the boys don't have much protection here, but bad as I need this old dog, I can make out without him until your man comes. But Ma shook her head.
No, Mr. Sanderson, he's your dog, and the longer we keep him, the harder it's going to be for us to give him up. You take him along. I can make the boys understand.
The man tied his rope around Old Yeller's neck and then mounted his horse. And that's when little Arliss caught on to what was happening. He threw a wall-eyed fit. He screamed and he hollered. He grabbed up a bunch of rocks and went to throwing them at Bud Sanderson. One hit Sanderson's horse in the flank. The horse bogged his head, went to pitching and a bawling and a grunting, and this excited Old Yeller. He chased after the horse, baying him at the top of his voice, and what with Ma running after little Arliss hollering for him to shut up and quit throwing them rocks, it was altogether the biggest and loudest commotion that had taken place around our cabin for a good little while. When Burns Anderson finally riding the pitch out of his scared horse, he hollered at Old Yeller. He told him he'd best hush up that racket before he got his brains beat out, and then he rode back towards us wearing a wide grin. His grin got wider as he saw how Ma and I were holding little Arliss. We each had him by one wrist, and were holding him clear off the ground. He couldn't get at any more rocks to throw that way, but it sure didn't keep him from dancing up and down the air and screaming. Oh, turn him loose, Sanderson said with a big smile. He's not going to throw any more rocks at me. He swung down from his saddle. He came and got little Arliss and loved him up till he hushed up screaming, and then said, Look here, boy, do you really want that thieving old dog? He held little Arliss off and stared him straight in the eyes, waiting for Arliss to answer. Little Arliss stared straight back at him and didn't say a word. Well, do you? He insisted. Finally, little Arliss nodded and then tucked his chin and looked away. All right, Burns Sanderson said. We'll make us a trade, just betwixt you and me. I'll let you keep the old rascal, but you got to do something for me. He waited till little Arliss finally got up the nerve to ask what, and then went on. Well, it's like this. I've hung around here in this cow camp eating my own cooking so that I'm pretty well starved out, that I hardly even throw a shadow anymore. I'll tell you what, if you can talk your ma into feeding me a real jam-up meal of some woman-cooked grub, I think it'll be worth at least one yeller dog. What do you think? Well, I didn't wait to hear any more. I run off. I was so full of relief that I was about to pop, and I knew that if I didn't get out of sight in a hurry, that Burns Sanderson was going to catch me crying. Ma cooked the best dinner that day that I ever ate. We had roast venison, fried catfish, stewed squirrel, and black-eyed peas, and cornbread, flour gravy, and butter, wild honey, and hog plum jelly, and fresh buttermilk. I ate till it seemed like my eyeballs would pop out of my head, and still didn't make anything like the showing of that Bern Sanderson made. He was a slim man, not nearly as big as Pa, and I never could figure out where he put all that grub. But long before he finally sighed and shook his head at the last squirrel stew, I was certain of one thing. He sure wouldn't have any trouble throwing a shadow on the ground for the rest of that day. A good black shadow. After dinner, he sat around for a while, talking to me and Ma, and making little Arless some toy horses out of dried corn stalks. Then he said his thank yous to Ma and told me to come with him. I followed with him while he led his horse down to the spring for water. I remember how Pa had led me away from the house like that the day he had left, and knew by that Bern Sanderson had something he wanted to talk to me about. At the spring, he slipped the bit out of his horse's mouth to let him drink, and then turned to me. "Now, son," he said, didn't want to tell your Ma this, but I didn't want to worry her, but there seems to be a plague of hydrophobia going around, and I want you to be on the lookout for it." I felt a scare run through me. I didn't know much about hydrophobia, but after what Bud Searcy had told me about his uncle that died chained to a tree, I knew it was something bad. I stared at Bern Sanderson and didn't say anything. "There ain't no mistake about it. I done shot 2 wolves and a fox and a skunk that had it, and over at Salt Licks a woman had to kill a bunch of house cats that her young'uns had been playing with. She wasn't sure, but she couldn't afford to take any chances, and you can't either." "But how will I know what to shoot and what not to?" I wanted to know. "Well, you can't hardly tell at first, not until they're already gone to foaming at the mouth and are reeling with the blind staggers. Any time you see a critter acting that way, you know for sure. But watch for others that aren't that far along. You take a pet cat now. He takes to spitting and fighting at you for no reason. You best shoot him. And same with a dog. He'll get mad at nothing and want to bite you. Take a fox or a wildcat. You know they'll run from you when they don't want to fight, and they'll try and make a fight at you. You better shoot 'em. Shoot anything that acts unnatural and don't fool around about it. It's too late after they've been bitten or they scratch you." Talk like that made my heart jump up in my throat till I could hardly catch a breath. I looked down at the ground and went to kicking around some rocks. "You're not scared now, are you, boy? I'm only telling you because I know that your pa left you in charge of things, and I know you can handle whatever comes up. I'm just telling you to watch close and don't let anything get to you or your folks with hydrophobia. You think you can do it?" I swallowed. "I can do it. I'm not scared," I told him. The sternness left Bern Sanderson's face, and he put a hand on my shoulder just as Pa had the day he left. "Good boy. That's the way a man talks." Then he gripped my shoulder real tight, mounted his horse, and rode off through the brush. And I was so scared and mixed up about the dangers of hydrophobia that it was clear into the next day before I ever thought about thanking him for giving us Old Yeller. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. A boy, before he really grows up, is pretty much like a wild animal. He can get the wits scared clear out of him today, and by tomorrow have forgotten all about it. At least, that's the way it was with me. I was pretty scared of the hydrophobic plague that Bern Sanderson's had told me about, and I could hardly sleep that night. I kept picturing in my mind mad dogs and mad wolves reeling about with the blind staggers, drooling slobbers and snapping and biting at everything in sight. Maybe biting Ma or little Arless so that they got the sickness and went mad too. I lay in bed, shuddering and shivering and dreaming all sorts of nightmares happening. And then, the next day, I went to rounding up and marking the hogs and forgot all about the plague. Our hogs ran loose on the range in those days, the same as our cattle. We fenced them out of the fields, but never into a pasture. We had no pastures. We never fed them, unless maybe it was a little corn when we threw it to them during a bad spell in the winter, and the rest of the time they looked after themselves. They slept out, and they ate out. In the summertime, they slept in the cool places around the water holes, sometimes in the water. In the winter, they could always tell at least a day ahead of time when a blizzard was on its way, and then they'd gang up and pack tons of leaves and dried grass and sticks into some dense thicket or cave. They'd pile all these things into a huge bed and sleep on until the cold spell blew over. They ranged all over the hills and down into the canyons. In season, they fed on acorns and berries, wild plums, prickly pear apples, grass, weeds, bulb plants which they rooted out of the ground. They especially liked the black wild persimmons that the Mexicans call chapotes. Sometimes, too, they'd eat a newborn calf if the ma cow couldn't keep them honed away, or a baby fawn that the doe had left hidden in the tall grass. Once, in a real dry spell, Pa and I saw an old sow standing belly deep in a dried-up pothole of water, catching and eating perch that were trapped in there and couldn't get away. Most of these meat-eaters were old hogs, however. Starvation during some bad drought or extra cold winter had forced them to eat anything they could get a hold of. Generally, Pa said, they started out by feeding on the carcass of some deer or cow that had died, and then going from there to catching and killing live meat. He told a tale of how one old range hog had caught him when he was a baby and his folks got there just in time to save him. It was that sort of thing, I guess, that made Ma so afraid of wild hogs. The least little old bite and shoot could make her take for cover. She didn't like it a bit when I started out to catch and mark all the pigs that our sow had raised that year. She knew we had to do it, else we couldn't tell our hogs from those of the neighbors, but she didn't like the idea of my doing it alone. But I'm not working hogs alone, Ma, I pointed out. I got old Yeller, and Bern Sanderson says he's a real good hog dog. Well, that don't mean a thing, Ma said. All hog dogs are good ones. A good one is the only kind that can work hogs and live, but the best dog in the world won't keep you from getting all cut to pieces if you ever make a slip. Well, Ma was right. I'd worked with Pa enough to know that any time you mess with a wild hog, you were asking for trouble. You let him alone and he'll generally snort and run from you on sight, the same as a deer. But once you corner him, he's the most dangerous animal that ever lived in Texas. You catch a squealing pig out of a bunch, and you got a battle on your hands. All of them will turn on you at one time, and here they come, roaring and popping their teeth, cutting high and fast with gleaming white tusks that kept wet to the sharpness of a knife point. And there was no bluff in them either. They meant business. They'd kill you if they could get to you, and if you're not fast-footed and don't keep a close watch, they'll get to you. They had to be that way to live in a country where the wolves and bobcats and panthers and bears were always after them, trying for a bite of fresh hog meat. And it was because of this that nearly all hog owners usually left 4 or 5 old burros, or bar hogs, as we called them, to run with each bunch of sows. The bar hogs weren't any more vicious than the boars, but they'd hang with the sows and help them protect the pigs and chutes when generally the boars pulled off to range around alone. I knew all about these range hogs and plenty more, yet I still wasn't bothered about the job that was facing me. In fact, I sort of looked forward to it. Working wild hogs was always exciting and generally proved to be a lot of fun. I guess the main reason I felt this way was because Pa and I had figured out a quick and nearly foolproof way of doing it. We could catch most of the pigs we needed to mark and castrate without even getting in reach of the old hogs. It took a good hound dog to pull off the trick, but the way Burn Sanderson talked about Old Yeller, I was willing to bet that he was that good. And he was, too. He caught on right away. We located our first bunch of hogs at a seep spring at the head of a shallow dry wash that led back towards Bird Song Creek. There were 7 sows, 2 long-tusked old bar hogs, and 14 little shouts. They'd come there to drink and wallow around in the potholes of soft, cool mud. They caught wind of us about the same time I saw them. The old hogs threw up their snouts and said, "Ruh!" And then they all tore for the hills, running through the rocks and brush almost as swiftly and silently as a deer. "Head 'em, Yeller," I hollered. "Go get 'em, boy." But it was a waste of words. Old Yeller was already done gone. He streaked down the slant, crossing the draw, and had the tail-end pig caught by the hind leg before the others knew he was after them. The pig set up a loud squeal. Instantly all the old hogs wheeled, and they came at Old Yeller with their bristles up, roaring and popping their teeth. Yeller held on to his pig until I thought for a second they had him, and then he let go, whirled away, running towards me, but running slow. Slow enough the old hogs kept chasing him, thinking every second they were going to catch him on the next one. When they finally saw they couldn't, the old hogs stopped and formed a tight circle. They faced outward from the ring, their rumps to the center, where all the squealing pigs were gathered. That way, they were ready to battle anything that wanted to jump on them. That was the way they used to fight bears and panthers off from their young, and that's the way they aimed to fight us off as well. But we were too smart, Old Yeller and I. We knew better than to try and break into that tight ring of threatening tusks. Anyway, we didn't need to. All we needed was just to move the hogs along to where we wanted them, and Old Yeller already knew how to do this. Back he went, right into their faces, where he pestered them with yelling bays and false rushes till they couldn't stand it. With an angry roar, one of the burros broke the ring to charge him. Instantly, all the others charged as well. They were right on Old Yeller again, and they were just about to get him. Just let them within a few inches closer, and one of them would slam a 4-inch tusk into his soft belly. The thing was, Old Yeller never would let them gain that last few inches on him. They cut and slashed at him from behind and both sides, yet he never was quite there. Always he was just a little bit beyond their reach, yet still so close they couldn't help thinking that the next try was sure to get him. It was a blood-chilling game Old Yeller played with the hogs, but one you could see he enjoyed by the way he went after it. Give him time, and he'd take that bunch of angry hogs clear down out of the hills and into the pens at home, if that's where I wanted them, never driving them, just lead them along. But that's where Pa and I had other hog hunters outfigured. We almost never took our hogs to the pens to work them anymore. That took too much time. Also, after we had them penned, there was still the dangerous job of catching the pigs away from the old ones. I hollered at Old Yeller. "Bring 'em on over, Yeller," I said. Then I turned and headed for a big gnarled live oak tree that stood in a clear patch of ground down the draw a piece. I picked out that tree because it had a huge branch that stuck out to one side, and I went and looked the branch over and saw that it was just right. It was low, yet still far enough above the ground to be out of reach of the highest cutting hog. I climbed up the tree and squatted on the branch. I unwound my rope from where I'd packed it, coiled around my waist, and shook out a loop, and then I hollered for Old Yeller to bring the hogs over. He did what I told him. He brought the fighting hogs to the tree and rallied them in a ring around it. Then he stood back, holding them there while he cocked his head sideways at me, wanting to know what came next. Well, I soon showed him. I waited till one of the pigs came trotting under my limb, and I dropped my loop about him and gave it a quick yank, lifted him up, squealing and kicking, out of the shuffling and roaring mass of the hogs below. I clamped him betwixt my knees, pulled out my knife, and went to working on him. First I folded his right ear and sliced out a 3-cornered gap in the top side, a mark that we called an overbite. Then, from the underside of his left ear, I slashed a long strip that ran clear to the point. That is what we called an underslope, and that had him marked for me. Our mark was overbite on the right and underslope the left. Other settlers had other marks, like crop the right and underbite the left, or 2 underbites on the right ear, or a slope on the left and an underbite in the right. Everybody knew the hog mark of everyone else, and we all respected them. We never butchered or sold a hog that didn't belong to us, or marked a pig following a sow that didn't wear our mark. Cutting marks on a pig's ear is bloody work, and the scared pig kicks and squeals like he's dying, but he's not really hurt. What hurts him is the castration, and I never did like that part of the job. But it had to be done, and still does if you want to eat hog meat. You let a boar hog get grown out without cutting his seeds out, and his meat's too tough and rank smelling to even eat it. The squealing of the pig and the scent of his blood made the hogs beneath me so near wild with anger. You never heard such a roaring and teeth popping as they kept circling a tree and rearing up on its trunk trying to get at me. The noise they made and the hate and anger that showed in their eyes was enough to chill your blood. Only I was used to the feeling and didn't let it bother me. That is, not much. Sometimes I'd let my mind slip for a minute and get to thinking how they'd slash me to pieces if I happened to fall out of that tree, and I'd sort of get a cold shudder that run all over me. But Pa had told me right from the start that fear was a right and natural feeling for anybody, and nothing to be ashamed of. It's a thing of your mind, he said, and you can train your mind to handle it just like you can train your arm to throw a rock. And put that way, it made sense to be afraid, so I didn't bother about it. I'd put in all my time trying to train my mind not to let fear stampede me. Sometimes it did yet, of course, but not when I was working hogs. I'd had enough experience at working hogs that now I could generally look down and laugh at them. I finished the first pig, dropped it to the ground, and then, one after another, I roped the others, dangling them up into the tree and working them over. A couple times the old hogs on the ground got so mad they broke ranks and charged Old Yeller, but right from the start, Old Yeller had caught on to what I wanted. Every time they chased him from the tree, he'd run off a little ways and then circle back and then stand far enough away that they'd rally around my tree again. In less than an hour, I was done with the job, and the only trouble we had was getting the hogs to leave the tree after I was finished. After going through so much trouble to hold the hogs under the tree, Old Yeller had a hard time understanding that I finally wanted them out of the way. And even after I got 'em to leave, the hogs were so mad and suspicious that I had to squat there in the tree for nearly an hour longer before they finally drifted away into the brush, making it safe for me to come on down. End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. With hogs ranging in the woods like that, it was hard to know for certain when you'd found them all. But I kept a piece of ear from each pig I marked, and I carried the pieces home in my pockets and then stuck them on a sharp pointed stick which I kept hung in the corn crib. When the count reached 46 and I couldn't seem to locate any new bunches of hogs, Ma and I decided that was all the pigs the sows had raised that year. So I had left off hog hunting and started getting ready to gather corn when Bud Searsey paid us another visit. He told me about one bunch of hogs I'd missed. "They're clear back in that Bat Cave country, the yonder side of Salt Licks," he said. Russell Simpson ran into them a couple days ago, feeding on prickly pear apples and them prickly pear flats. Says that there's 5 pigs following, 3 sows wearing your mark. Couple old bar hogs ranging with him. I'd never been that far to the other side of Salt Branch before, but Pa had told me about the Bat Cave. I figured I could find the place, so the next morning I set out with Old Yeller, glad for the chance to hunt hogs a while longer before sitting in the can for corn gathering. Also, if I was lucky and found the hogs early, maybe I'd have time to visit the cave and watch the bats come out. Pa had told me that was a real sight, the way the bats came out in the late afternoon, and I was sure anxious to go and see it. I always liked to see the far places and see strange sights. Like one place at Salt Branch that I'd found. There was a high, undercut cliff there and some birds building their nests against the face of it, and they were gray, sharp-winged swallows. They gathered sticky mud out of the hog wallow, and then carried it up and stuck it to the bare rocks of the cliff, shaping the mud into little bulging nests with a single hole in the center of each one. The young birds hatched out of there and stuck their heads out through the holes to get at the worms and the bugs that the grown birds brought to them. The mud nests were so thick on the face of the cliff that, from a distance, the wall looked like it was covered in honeycomb. There was another place I liked too. It was a wild, lonesome place down in a deep canyon that was bent to the shape of a horseshoe. Tall trees grew down in the canyon and leaned out over a deep hole in the clear water. In the trees nested hundreds of long-shanked herons, blue ones and white ones with black wing-tips. The herons built huge, ragged nests of sticks and trash and sat around the trees all day long, fussing and straining the tree branches with their white droppings. And beneath them, down in the clear water, yard-long catfish lay on the sandy bottom, waiting to gobble up any young birds that happened to fall out of the nests. The Bat Cave sounded like another one of those wild places that I'd love to see, and I sure hoped I could locate the hogs in time to pay it a visit while I was close by. We located the hogs in plenty of time, but before we were done with them, I didn't want to see a bat cave or anything else. Old Yeller struck the hog's trail at a water hole, and he ran the scent out into a regular forest of prickly pear. Bright red apples fringed the edges of the pear pads. In places where the hogs had fed, bits of peel and black seeds and red juice stain lay on the ground. The sight made me wonder again how a hog could be tough enough to eat prickly pear apples with their millions of little hair-like spines. I ate them myself sometimes, for pear apples are good eating. But even after I'd polished them clean by rubbing them in the sand, I generally wound up with several stickers in my mouth. But hogs didn't seem to mind the stickers. Neither did the old wild turkeys or the pack rats or the big-eared ring-tail cats. All those creatures came to the pear flats when the apples started turning red. Old Yeller's yelling bay told me he had caught up with the hogs, and I heard their roaring rumbles and ran through the pear clumps towards the sound. They were the hogs that Russell Simpson had sent word about, and there were 5 pigs, 3 sows, and a couple bar hogs, all but the piglets wearing our mark. Their faces bristled with long pear spines they had got stuck with, reaching for apples. Red juice stain was smeared all over their snouts, and they stood backed up against a big prickly pear clump. Their anger had their bristles standing in high fierce ridges along their backbones, and they roared and popped their teeth and dared me or Old Yeller to try and catch one of the squealing piglets. I looked around for the closest tree. It stood better off more than a quarter mile. It was going to be a rough on Old Yeller trying to lead him over to it. Having to duck and dodge around in those prickly pears, he was bound to come out bristling with more pear spines than the hogs had in their face. But I couldn't see any other way to take them. So I struck off towards the tree, hollering at Old Yeller to bring him along. A deep cut bank draw ran through the pear flats between me and that huge mesquite tree I was heading for, and it was down in the bottom of that draw that the hogs stopped. They'd found a place where the ford waters had undercut one of the dirt banks to form a little shallow cave. They'd backed up under the bank with the piglets behind them. No amount of barking or pestering by Old Yeller could get them out. Now and then, an old bar hog would break ranks and make a quick lunge at the dog, but when Old Yeller leapt away, the hog wouldn't follow. He'd go right back to fill the gap he had left in the half circle his mates had formed in front of the cave. The hogs knew they had found a natural spot for making a fighting stand, and they didn't aim to leave it. I went back and stood on the bank above them, looking down, wondering what to do. Well, then it come to me that all I needed to do was go to work. This dirt bank would serve just as well as a tree, and there were the hogs right underneath me. They couldn't get to me from down there, not without first having to go maybe 50 yards down the draw just to find a place out, and Old Yeller, he wouldn't let them do that. It wouldn't be easy to reach beneath that undercut bank and rope a pig, but I figured it could be done. I took my rope from around my waist and shook out a loop. I moved to the lip of the cut bank, and the pigs were too far back under for me to have a good throw. Well, maybe if I lay down on my stomach, I could reach them. I did. I reached back under and picked up the first pig, slick as a whistle. I drew him out, worked him over, then I dropped him back and watched the old hog sniff his bloody wounds. The scent of his blood made them madder, and they roared louder. I lay there and waited. A second piglet moved out from the back of the cave that I couldn't quite see. He still wasn't quite far enough out, and I inched forward, leaned further down to where I could see better, and I could reach him now with my loop. I made my cast, and that's when it happened. The dirt bank broke beneath my weight. A wagon load of sand caved off and spilled down over the angry hogs, and I went with the sand. Well, I guess I screamed. I don't know. It happened too fast. All I could really remember in that heart-stopping scare I knew as I tumbled, head over heels, down amongst those killer hogs. The crumbling sand all but buried the hogs. I guess that's what saved me at the start. I remember bumping into the back of one old boar hog, and then, leaping to my feet in a smothering fog of dry dust, I jumped blindly to one side as far as I could, and I broke to run, but I was too late. A slashing tusk caught me in the calf of my right leg, and a shearing pain shot up into my body, and I screamed, and I stumbled, went down. I screamed louder then, knowing I could never get to my feet in time to escape the rush of that angry hogs that was roaring down all upon me. It was Old Yeller who saved me. It was just like he saved little Arless from that she-bear. He came in, roaring with rage. He flung himself between me and those killer hogs. Fangs bared, he met them head-on, slashing and snarling. He yelled with pain as the savage tusks ripped into him, and he took the awful punishment that was meant for me. But he held his ground. He gave me that 1 in 100 chance to get free, and I took it. I leapt to my feet, and in terror I ran along the banks of that dry wash, right up a slope bank, and then I took out for the forest of prickly pear. I ran till a forked stick tripped me and I fell. It seemed like that fall, or maybe it was the long prickly pear spines that stabbed me in the hip, brought me out of my scare. I sat up, still panting for breath, and with the blood hammering in my ears. But I was all in my right mind now, and I yanked the spines out of my hip, and then pulled up my slashed pants to look at my leg. Sight of so much blood nearly threw me into another panic. It was streaming out of the cut and clear down into my shoe. I sat and stared at it for a while, shivering. Then I got a hold of myself again. I wiped away the blood. The gash was a bad one. It was clear to the bone, I could tell it, and plenty long. But it didn't hurt much. Not yet, that is. The main hurting would start later, I guessed. After the bleeding stopped, my legs started to get stiff. I guessed I'd best hurry and tie up a place and get home as quick as I could. Once that leg started getting stiff, I just might not make it back home. I took my knife and cut a strip off the tail of my shirt and bound my leg as tight as I could. And I got up to see if I could walk with the leg wrapped as tight as I had, and I could. But when I set out, it wasn't in the direction of home. It was back along the trail through the prickly pear. I don't know quite what made me do it. I didn't think to myself, Old Yeller saved my life, and I can't go off and leave him. He's bound to be dead. But it would sure look mighty shabby to go home without finding out for sure. I have to go back. Even my leg hurts, and it gives out before I can get home. I didn't think any of that. I just started walking in that direction, and I kept walking till I found him. He lay in the dry wash from where I left him to go running through the prickly pear. He had tried to follow me, but he was too hurt to keep going. He was holed up under a broad slab of red sand rock stone that had slipped off a high bank and was now propped up against a round boulder in such a way to form a bit of a cave. He had taken refuge there from the hogs. The hogs were gone now, but I could see their tracks in the sand around the rocks where they tried to get at him from behind. I'd have missed him, hidden there under that rock slab, if he hadn't whined as I walked past. I knelt beside him and coaxed him out from under the rocks. He grunted and groaned as he dragged himself towards me, and he sank back to the ground, his blood-smeared body trembling while he wiggled his stubbed tail and tried to lick my hog-cut leg. A big lump came up in my throat, and tears stung my cheeks and eyes where they started to be blinded. And here he was, trying to lick my wounds when he was bleeding from a dozen worse ones. And worst of all was his belly. It was ripped wide open, and some of his insides were bulging up through the slit. It was a horrible sight. It was so horrible that for a second I couldn't even look at it. I wanted to run off. I didn't want to stay and look at something that filled me with such numbing terror, but I didn't run off. I shut my eyes and made myself run a hand over Old Yeller's head, and the stickiness of the blood of it made my flesh crawl, but I made myself do it. Maybe I couldn't do him any good, but I wasn't going to run off and leave him to die all by himself. Well, then it come to me that he wasn't dead yet, and maybe he didn't have to die. Maybe there was something I could do to save him. Maybe if I hurried home, I could get Ma to come back and help me. Ma, she'd know what to do. Ma always knew what to do when somebody got hurt. I wiped the tears from my eyes with my shirt sleeves and made myself think what to do. I took off my shirt and tore it into strips. I used a sleeve to wipe the sand from the belly wound, and carefully I eased his entrails back into place. And then I pushed the lips of the wound together and wound strips of my shirt round Old Yeller's belly. I wound them up tight and tied the strips together so that they wouldn't work loose. All the time I worked on Old Yeller, he didn't let out a whimper. But when I shoved him back under the rock where he'd been out of the hot sun, he started whining. I guess he knew I was fixing to leave him, and he wanted to go too. He started crawling back out of his hole. I stood and studied for a while. I needed to do something to stop up that opening so Old Yeller couldn't get out. It would have to be something too big and heavy for him to shove aside. I thought of a rock, went looking for one, and what I found was even better. It was an uprooted and dead mesquite tree laying on the bank of the wash. The stump end of the mesquite was big and heavy. It was almost too much for me to drag to the loose sand. I heaved and I sweated and I started my leg to bleeding again, but I managed to get that tree stump where I'd wanted it. I slid Old Yeller back under the rock slab, and I scolded him and made him stay there till I had hauled that tree stump into place. And like I had figured, the stump just about filled the opening. Maybe a strong dog could have squeezed through the narrow opening that was left, but I didn't figure Old Yeller could. I figured he'd be safe in there till I could get back. Yeller lay back under the rock slab now, staring at me with a look in his eyes that made that choking lump come down into my throat again. It was a begging look, and Old Yeller wasn't the kind to beg. I reached in and let him lick my hand. "Yeller," I said, "I'll be back. I'm promising that I'll be back." Then I let out for home in a limping run. His howl followed me, and it was the most mournful howl I ever did hear. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11. It looked like I'd never get back to where I'd left Old Yeller. To begin with, by the time I got home, I'd traveled too far and too fast. I was so hot and weak and played out that I was trembling all over, and that hog-cut leg was sure acting up. My leg hadn't gotten stiff like I'd figured. I'd used it too much. But I'd strained the cut muscle, and it was jerking and twitching long before I got home, and after I got there it wouldn't stop. That threw a big scare into Ma. I argued and fussed, trying to tell her about what bad shape Old Yeller was in and how we needed to hurry back to him, but she wouldn't pay me no mind. She told me,
"We're not going anywhere until we've cleaned up and doctored that leg. I've seen hog cuts before. If you neglect them, they can be as dangerous as a snake bite. Now you hold still till I get through."
I saw that it wasn't of any use, so I held still while she got hot water and washed the cut. But when she poured turpentine into the place, I couldn't hold still. I jumped and hollered and screamed. It was like she had burnt me with a red-hot iron. It hurt worse than when that hog even slashed me. I hollered with hurt till little Arless turned up and went to crying too. But when the pain finally left my leg, the muscle had quit jerking. Ma got some clean white rags and bound up the wound. And then she said,
"Now you lie down on that bed and rest. I don't want to see you take another step on that leg for a week."
I was so stunned that I couldn't say a word. All I could do was stare at her. Old Yeller laying way off out there in those hills, about to die if he didn't get help, and Ma telling me I couldn't walk. Well, I got up off the stool I'd been sitting on, and I said to her, "Ma, I'm going back after Old Yeller, and I promised I'd come back, and that's what I aim to do." Then I walked through the door and out to the lot. By the time I got Jumper caught, Ma had her bonnet on, and she was ready to go too. She looked a little flustered, like she didn't know what to do with me, but all she said was,
"How are we going to bring him back?"
"On Jumper," I said. "I'll ride Jumper and hold Old Yeller in my arms."
"You know better than that," she said. "He's too big and heavy. I might be able to lift him up to you, but you can't stand to hold him in your arms that long. You'll give out."
"I'll hold him," I said, "and if I do give out, I'll rest and then we'll go on again." Ma stood tapping her foot for a minute while she gazed off across the hills. She said, like she was talking to herself,
"We can't use the cart. There aren't any roads and the country's too rough."
Suddenly she turned to me and smiled.
"I know what. Get that cowhide off the fence. I'll go get some pillows."
"Cowhide?"
"And tie it across Jumper's back. I'll show you later."
I didn't know what she had in mind, but it didn't much matter. She was going with me. I got the cowhide and slung it across Jumper's back. It rattled and spooked him so that he snorted and jumped from underneath it. "You Jumper," I shouted at him, "you hold still." He held still the next time, and Ma brought the pillows and the long coil of rope. She had me tie the cowhide to Jumper's back and bind the pillows up on top, and then she lifted little Arless up and set him down on top of the pillows.
"You ride on behind him," she said to me. "I'll walk."
We could see the buzzards gathering long before we got there. We could see them whirling black against the blue sky and dropping lower and lower with each circle. One we saw didn't waste time to circle. He came hurtling down on a long, slanted dive, his ugly head outstretched, his wings all but shut against his body. He shot past right over our head, and the whoosh and sound his body made and split in the air sent cold chills running all through me. I guess it was all over for Old Yeller. Ma was walking ahead of Jumper. She looked back at me, and the look in her eyes told me that she figured the same thing. I got so sick it seemed like I couldn't stand it. But when we moved down into the prickly pear flats, all my misery eased some. For suddenly, up out of the wash arose a flurry of flapping wings. Something had disturbed those buzzards, and I thought I knew what it was. A second later, I was sure it was Old Yeller. His yelling bark sounded thin and weak. Just enough to hear it made me want to holler, run, and laugh. He was still alive. He was still able to fight back. The frightened buzzards had settled back to the ground by the time we got there. When they caught sight of us, though, they got excited and went to trying to get off the ground again. For birds that can sail around in the air all day, with hardly more than movement of their wing tips, they sure were clumsy and awkward about getting started. Some had to keep hopping along the wash for 50 yards, beating the air with their huge wings before they were able to finally take off. And then, even then, they were slow to rise. I could have shot a dozen of them before they got away if I had thought to bring my gun along. There was sort of a crazy light shining in Old Yeller's eyes when I looked in on him. When I reached to drag the stump away, he snarled and lunged at me with bared fangs. I jerked my hands away just in time and shouted, "Yeller!" at him. Then he knew I wasn't a buzzard. The crazy light went out of his eyes and he sank back into the hole with a loud groan, just like he had a huge load taken off his mind. Ma helped me drag the stump away. Then we reached in, rolled his hurt body over on its back, and slid him out into the light. Without bothering to examine the blood-caked cuts that she could see all over his head and shoulders, Ma started unwinding the cloth about his body. Then little Arless came crowding past me, asking in a scared voice what the matter was with the Yeller. Ma stopped.
"Arless, do you think you could go back down this sandy wash here and catch Ma a pretty green striped lizard? I thought I saw one down there around the first bend."
Little Arless was as pleased as I was surprised. Always before, Ma had sort of put up with his lizard catching, and now she wanted him to go and catch one just for her. A delighted grin spread over his face, and he turned and ran down the wash as hard as he could go. Ma smiled up at me and suddenly understood. She was just getting little Arless out of the way so he wouldn't have to look at the terrible sight of Yeller's slitted belly. She said to me,
"Go jerk a long hair out of Jumper's tail, son, but make sure you stand to one side so he won't kick you."
I went and stood to one side of Jumper and jerked the long hair out of his tail. And sure enough, he snorted and kicked at me, but he missed. I took the hair back to Ma, wondering as much about it as I had about the green striped lizard. But when Ma pulled the long sewing needle from her dress front and poked the small end of the tail hair through the eye, I knew then.
"Horsehair is always better than thread for sewing up a wound," she said.
She didn't say why, and I never did think to ask her. Ma asked me if any of Yeller's entrails had been cut, and I told her that I didn't think so.
"Well, I won't bother them then. Anyway, if they are, I don't think I could fix them."
It was a long, slow job, stitching up Old Yeller's belly, and the way his flesh would flinch and quiver when Ma poked the needle through, it must have hurt something awful. But if it did, Old Yeller didn't say anything about it. He just lay there, licking my hands while I held him. We were wrapping him up in some clean rags that Ma had brought along when here came little Arless. He was running as hard as he had been when he left, and he was grinning and hollering at Mama, and in his right hand he carried a green striped lizard as well. How on earth he managed to catch anything as fast running as one of those green striped lizards, I don't know, but he sure had one. And you never saw such a proud look as he wore on his face when he handed that lizard to Ma. And I never guess I ever saw a more helpless look on Ma's face as she took it. Ma had always been squeamish about lizards, snakes, and bugs and such things, and you could tell it just made her flesh crawl to have to touch this one, but she took it and admired it and thanked little Arless something fierce. And then she asked him if he'd be willing to keep it for her till we got home, which little Arless was sure glad to do.
Now, Arless, she said, we're going to play us a game. We're playing like Old Yeller's sick, and you have to take care of him. We're going to let you both ride on the cowhide like Sink Indians would do.
Well, it always pleased little Arless to play any sort of game, and this was a new one he had never heard about before. And he was so anxious to get started that we could hardly keep him from underfoot till Ma had things ready. As soon as she took the cowhide off Jumper's back and spread it hair side down upon the ground, I began to get the idea. She placed the soft pillows on top of the hide, and then helped me to ease Old Yeller's hurt body onto the pillows.
Now, Arless, you sit there on those pillows with Old Yeller and help him hold still. But remember, don't play with him or get on top of him. We're playing like he's sick, and when your dog is sick, you gotta be real careful with him.
It was a fine game, and little Arless fell right in with it. He sat where Ma told him to, and he held Old Yeller's head in his lap, waiting for the ride to begin. It didn't take long. I'd already tied a rope around Jumper's neck, leaving the loop big enough that it would pull back upon his shoulders. And then, on each corner of Jumper, we tied another rope into the ends that were knotted about his shoulders, and we carried the ends of them back to the cowhide. I took my knife and cut 2 slits into the edge of the cowhide, and then tied a rope into each one. We measured to get each rope about the same length, and made sure they were far enough back that the cowhide wouldn't touch Jumper's heels. Like most mules, Jumper was mighty fussy about anything touching his heels.
Now, Travis, you ride him and I'll lead him.
You better let me walk, I argued. Jumper's liable to throw a fit with that hide rattling around behind him, and you might not be able to catch him yourself.
You ride him. I don't want you walking on that leg any more. If Jumper acts up one time, I'll take the club to him myself.
Well, we started off with little Arless crowing at what a fine ride he was getting on the dragon hide, and sure enough, at the first sound of the rattling hide, old Jumper acted up. He snorted and tried to lunge to one side, but Ma yanked down on his bridle and said, "Jumper, you wrench!" And I whacked him between the ears with a dead stick. With the two of us coming at him like that, it was more than Jumper wanted. He settled down and went to traveling as quietly as he generally pulled a plow, with now and then just bending his neck around to take a look at what he was dragging. You could tell he didn't like it, but I guess he figured that he best put up with it. Little Arless never had a finer time than he did on that ride home. He enjoyed every long hour of it, and a part of the time, I don't guess it was too rough on Old Yeller. The cowhide dragged smooth and even, as long as we stayed in the sandy wash, and when we left the wash and took out across the flats, it still didn't look too bad. Maud led Jumper in a long roundabout way, keeping as much as she could to the openings where the tall grass grew. The grass would bend down before the hide, making a soft cushion over which the hide slipped easily. But this was rough country, and try as she could, Ma couldn't always dodge the rocky places. The hide slid over the rocks, same as over the sand and grass, but it couldn't do it without jolting the riders quite a bit. Little Arless would laugh when the hide raked along over the rocks and jolted him till his teeth rattled. He got as much fun out of that as the rest of the ride, but that jolt was hurting Old Yeller till something he couldn't hold back his whining. When Yeller's whining told us he was hurting too bad, we'd have a stop and wait for him to rest up, At other times, we stopped to give him water. Once we got water out of a little spring that trickled down through the rocks, and the next time was at Birdsong Creek. Ma had packed water to him in my hat. He was too weak to get up and drink, so Ma would hold the water right under his nose, and I'd lift him up off the pillows and hold him close enough that he could reach down and lap the water up with his tongue. Having to travel so far and so slow, with so many halts, it looked like we'd never get him home. But we finally made it, just about the time it was dark enough for the stars to show. By then, my hurt leg was pretty stiff, numb, and it was all swollen up, and felt as dead as a chunk of wood. And when I slid off Jumper's back, it wouldn't hold me. I fell clear to the ground and lay in the dirt, too tired and hurt to get up. Ma made a big to-do about how weak and hurt I was, but I didn't mind. We had gone and brought Old Yeller home, and he was still alive. And there, by the starlight, I could see him licking little Arless's face, and little Arless was sound asleep. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. For the next couple of weeks, Old Yeller and I had a rough time of it. I lay on the bed inside of the cabin, and Yeller lay on the cowhide in the dog run, and we both hurt so bad that we were wallowing and groaning and whimpering all the time. Sometimes I hurt so bad that I didn't quite know what was happening. I'd hear grunts and groans and couldn't tell if they were mine or Old Yeller's. My leg had swole up till it was about the size of a butter churn. I had such a wild hot fever that Ma nearly ran herself to death, packing fresh cool water from the spring which she used to bathe me all over, trying to keep my fever down. When she wasn't packing water, she was out digging prickly pear roots and hammering them to mush in a sack and then binding the mush to my leg in a poultice. We had lots of prickly pears growing close to the house, but they were the big tall ones and their roots weren't of any good. The kind that makes a good poultice was of the smaller size. They didn't have much top, but lots of knotty roots shaped sort of like sweet potatoes. That kind didn't grow close to home. Along at the last, Ma had to go clear over to Salt Licks to locate that kind. When Ma wasn't waiting for me, she was taking care of Old Yeller. She waited on him just like she did me, and she was getting up at all hours of the night to doctor our wounds, bathe us in cold water, and feed us when she could get us to eat. On top of that, there was the cows to milk, little Arless to look after, clothes to wash, and wood to cut, and old Jumper to worry about. The bad drought that old Bud Searcy predicted had come. The green grass all dried up till Jumper was no longer satisfied to eat it, and he took to jumping the field fence and eating the corn that I'd never gotten yet round to gathering. And Ma couldn't let that go on. That was our bread corn, and without it, we'd have no bread for the winter. But it looked like for a while there wasn't any way to save it. Ma would go to the field and run Jumper out, and then just before she got her back turned good, he'd jump back in and go to eating corn again. Finally, Ma figured out a way to keep Jumper from jumping. She tied a drag to him. She got a rope and tied one end of it to his right foreleg, and to the other end she tied a big heavy chunk of wood. And by pulling hard, Jumper could move his drag along enough to graze and get water, but any time he tried to rear up for a jump, the drag held him down. The drag on Jumper's foot saved the corn, but it didn't save Ma from a lot of work. Jumper was always getting his chunk of wood hung up behind a bush or a rock so that he couldn't get away. And then he'd have himself a big scare and rear up, fighting the rope and falling down and pitching and a-bawling. If Ma didn't hear him right away, he'd start braying, and he'd keep it up till she went and loosened the drag. Altogether, Ma sure had her hands full, and little Arless wasn't of any help. He was too little to do much work, and with neither of us to play with, he got lonesome. He'd follow Ma around every step she made, getting in the way and feeling hurt because she didn't have time to pay any attention to him, and when he wasn't pestering her, he was pestering me. A dozen times a day he'd come in and stare at me and say,
"What you doing in bed, Travis? Why don't you get up? Why don't you get up and come play with me?"
He nearly drove me crazy till the day Bud Circe and Elizabeth came bringing the pup. I didn't know about the pup at first. I didn't even know that Elizabeth had come. I heard Bud Circe talk to Ma when they rode up, but I was hurting too bad to even roll over and look out the door. I remember just laying there, being mad at Circe for coming. I knew what a bother he'd be to Ma, for all of his talk of looking after the women and children of Salt Licks while the men were gone. I knew he'd never turned a hand of any real work. You wouldn't catch him offering to chop wood or gather in a corn crop. All he'd do is sit out under the dog run all day, talking and chewing backer and spitting juice all over the place. On top of that, he'd expect Ma to cook him up a good dinner, and maybe a supper if he took a notion to stay that long. And Ma, she had 10 times too much to do like it was. In a little bit, though, I heard a quiet step at the door. I looked up. It was Elizabeth. She stood with her hands behind her back, staring at me with her big solemn eyes.
"You hurtin' pretty bad?"
she asked. I was hurting aplenty bad, but I wasn't admitting it to any girl. "I'm doing all right," I said.
"We didn't know you got hog caught, or we would have come sooner," she said.
I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything.
"Well, anyhow, I brung you a surprise,"
she said. I was too sick and worn out to care about a surprise right then, but there was such an eager look in her eyes that I knew I had to say what, or else I'd hurt her feelings. So I said, "What?"
"One of Miss Prissy's pups,"
she said. She brought her hands from behind her back. In the right one, she held a dog pup about the big as a year-old possum. It was a dirty white in color, and speckled all over with blue spots about the size of a cow tick. And she held it by the slack hide on the back of its neck, and it hung there half asleep, sagging in its own loose hide like it was dead.
"Born in a badger hole. 7 of them. I brung you the best one."
Well, I thought, if that puny-looking thing is the best one, Miss Prissy must have had a sorry litter of pups. But I didn't say so. I said, "Well, he sure looks like a dandy."
"He is. See how I've been holding him all this time, and he hasn't said a word?"
I'd heard that one all my life, that if a dog didn't holler when you held him up by the slack hide of his neck, he was sure to turn out to be a gritty one. I didn't think much of that sign. Pa always put more stock in what color was on the inside of a dog's mouth. If the pup's mouth was black inside, Pa said that was the one to choose, and that's the way I felt about it, too. But right now I didn't care if the pup's mouth was pea green on the inside. All I wanted was to just quit hurting. I said, "I guess little Arless will like it." And then I knew I'd said the wrong thing. I could tell by the look in her eyes that I had hurt her feelings, after all. She didn't say anything. She just got real still and quiet, and kept staring at me till I couldn't stand it and had to look away. Then she turned and went outside the cabin and gave the pup to little Arless. It made me mad, her looking at me like that. What did she expect anyhow? Here I was, laid up with a bad hog cut, hurting so bad I could hardly get my breath, and her expecting me to make a big to-do about a little old puny speckled pup. I had me a dog. Old Yeller was all cut up worse than I, but he was getting well. Ma had told me that. So what use did I have for a pup? Be all right for little Arless to play with, keep him occupied and out from underfoot. But when old Yeller and I got well and took to the woods again, we wouldn't have time to wait around on a fool pup that was too little to follow. I lay there in bed, mad and fretful all day, thinking how silly it was for Elizabeth to expect me to want a pup when I already had me a full-grown dog. I lay there, just waiting for a chance to tell her so, too, only she never did come back in and give me a chance. She stayed outside and played with little Arless and the pup till her paw finally wound up his talking and tobacco spitting and finally got ready to leave. Then I saw her and little Arless come past the door, heading for where I could hear her grandpa saddling his horse. She looked in at me, and then looked away, and suddenly I wasn't mad at her any more. I felt sort of mean. I wished now that I could think of the right thing to say about the pup, so I could call her back and tell her. I didn't want her to go off home with her feelings still hurt, but before I could think of anything, I heard her grandpa say to Ma, "Now, Miss Coates, you all are in sort of a bind here, with your man gone and that boy all crippled up, and I've been setting here all evening worrying about it. That's my responsibility, you know, seeing that everybody's taken care of while the men folk are gone, and I think now that maybe I got a way figured. I'll just leave our girl Elizabeth here to help you out." Ma said in a surprised voice,
Why, Mr. Searcy, there's no need for that. It's mighty kind of you and all, but we'll make out all right.
Now, Miss Coots, you got too big of a load to carry all by yourself. My Elizabeth, she'd be proud to help you out.
But she's such a little girl, Mr. Searcy. She's probably never stayed away from home for more than a night.
Oh, she's little, but she's stout and she's willing. She's like me. When folks are in trouble, she'll be pitching right in and doing her part. You just keep her here now. You'll see what a big help she'll be.
Ma tried to argue some more, but Bud Searcy wouldn't listen. He just told Elizabeth to be a good girl and help Ma out like she was used to helping out at home. Then he mounted and then rode off. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. I was like Mama. I didn't think Elizabeth Searcy would be any help around the place. She was too little and too skinny, and I figured she'd just be an extra bother for Ma. But we were wrong. Just like Bud Searcy said, she was a big help. She could tote water from the spring, she could feed the chickens and pack in wood, cook cornbread, wash dishes, and wash little Arless, and sometimes even change the prickly pear poultice on my leg. And she didn't have to be told either. She was right there on hand all the time, just looking for something to do. She was a lot better about that than I ever was. She wasn't as big, and she couldn't do as much as I could, but she was sure willing. She didn't even back off when Ma hooked Jumper to the cart and headed to the field to gather in the corn. That was a job I always hated. It was hot work, and the corn shucks made my skin itch and sting till sometimes I'd wake up at night scratching like I'd stumbled into a patch of bull nettles. But it didn't seem to bother Elizabeth. In fact, it seemed like she, Ma, and little Arless had a real good time gathering corn. I'd see them driving past the cabin, all three of them sitting on top of a cart load of corn, and they'd all be laughing and talking and having such a romping big time, playing with the speckled pup, that before long I half wished I was able to gather corn too. In a way, it sort of hurt my pride for a little old girl like Elizabeth to come in and take over my jobs. Pa had left me to look after things, but now I was laid up, and here was a girl handling my work about as good as I ever could. Still, she couldn't get out and mark hogs or kill meat or swing a chopping axe. Before they were finished gathering corn, however, we were faced with a trouble a whole lot too big for any of us to handle. The first of it came when the spot heifer failed to show up one evening at milking time. Ma had come in too late from the corn gathering to go look for her before dark, and the next morning she didn't need to. Spot came up by herself, or rather, she came past the house. I heard her first. The swelling in my leg was about gone down, and I was weak as a rain-chilled chicken, but most of the hurting had stopped, and I was able to sit up in bed a lot and take notice of things. I heard a cow coming towards the house. She was bawling like cows do when they've lost a calf or when their bag is stretched too tight with milk, and I recognized Spot's voice. Spot's calf recognized it too. It stood hungry in a pen all night, and now it was nearly crazy for a drink of milk. I could hear it blatting and racing around in the cow pen, so starved it could hardly wait, and I called to Ma. Ma, you better go let old Spot into her calf. I hear her coming.
That pesky Spot,
I heard her say impatiently.
I don't know what's gotten into her, staying out all night like that, letting her calf go hungry.
I heard Ma calling to Spot as she went out to the cow pen. And a moment later, I heard Spot bellow like a fighting bull, and then Ma's voice rising sharp and high. And then here come Ma, running into the cabin, calling for Elizabeth to hurry and bring in little Arless. There was a scare in Ma's voice, and I sat up in bed as Elizabeth came running in, dragging little Arless after her. Ma slammed the door shut and then turned to me.
Spot made fight at me. I can't understand it. It was like some vermin that she hadn't seen before.
Ma turned and opened the door a crack, and she looked out, and then threw the door wide open and stood staring towards the cow pen.
Why, look at her now. She's not paying one bit of attention to her calf. She's just going on past the cow pen like her calf wasn't there. She's acting as crazy as if she'd gotten a hold of a bite of pea vine.
There was a little pea vine that grew wild all over the hills during wet winters and bloomed pale lavender in the spring. Cattle and horses could eat it, mix with grass and get fat on it, but sometimes, when they got too big of a feed of it, it poisoned them. Generally, they'd stumble around with the blind staggers for a while and then gradually get well. Sometimes, though, the pea vine killed them. I sat there for a moment, listening to Spot. She was bawling again, like I had first heard her, but now she was heading off into the brush again, leaving her calf to starve. I wondered where she had gotten enough pea vine to hurt her. But Ma, she couldn't have eaten pea vine. The pea vine is all dead, and it's gone this time of year. Ma turned and looked at me and then looked away.
I know. That's what's got me so worried.
I thought of what Bern Sanderson had told me about animals that didn't act right, and I said, "Cows don't get hydrophobia, do they?" I saw Elizabeth start at the word, and she stared at me with big, solemn eyes.
I don't know. I've seen dogs with it, but I've never heard of a cow having it. I just don't know.
In the next few days, while Old Yeller and I healed fast, we all worried and watched. All day and all night, Spot came right on doing what she did from the start. She walked, and she bawled. She walked mostly in a wide circle that brought her pretty close to the house about twice a day, and then carried her so far into the hills that we barely heard her. And she walked with her head down, and she walked slower, and her bawling got weaker as she got weaker, but she never stopped walking and bawling. When the bull came, he was worse, and a lot more dangerous. He came 2 or 3 days later, and I was sitting out under the dog run at the time. I hobbled out in to sit in a chair beside Old Yeller, where I could scratch him underneath his chewed-off ear. That's where he liked to be scratched best. Ma was in the kitchen, cooking dinner. Elizabeth and little Arless had gone off to the crick below the spring to play with the pup and to fish for catfish. I could hear them running and laughing along the bank, chasing after grasshoppers for bait. And then I heard this moaning sound and turned to watch a bull come out of the brush. He was the roan bull, the one that the droopy horn shogo had dumped into the Mexican cart the day of the fight. But now he didn't walk like any bull that I had seen before. He walked with his head hung low and wobbling. He reeled and staggered like he couldn't see where he was going, and he walked head into a mesquite tree like it wasn't there, and then fell to his knees when he hit it. He scrambled to his feet, and came on, grunting and staggering and moaning, heading towards the spring. Right then, from the first time since we had brought him home, old Yeller come up off his cowhide bed. He was laying there beside me, paying no attention or sight of the bull, and then I guess the wind must have shifted and brought him the bull's scent, and evidently that scent told him for certain what I had only begun to suspect. He rose with a savage growl. He moved out towards the bull, so trembly weak that he could hardly stand. His loose lips were lifted in an ugly snarl, baring his white fangs. His hackles raised a ragged ridge along the back and shoulders. Watching him, I felt a prickling at the back of my own neck. I had seen him act like that before, but only when there was the greatest of danger. Never while just facing a bull. Suddenly I knew that Ma and I had been fooling ourselves. Up until now, we'd been putting up facing the facts. We kept hoping that the heifer Spot would get over whatever was wrong with her, and Ma and Elizabeth had kept Spot's calf from starving by letting it suck from another cow. They'd had to tie the cow's hind legs together to keep her from kicking the calf, but they kept her alive, hoping Spot would get well and come back to it. Now I knew that Spot wouldn't get well, and this bull wouldn't either, and I knew that they were both deadly sick with the hydrophobia. Old Yeller had scented that sickness in this bull and somehow sensed how fearfully dangerous it was. I thought of Elizabeth and little Arless down past the spring. I came out of my chair, calling for Ma. "Ma, bring me my gun, Ma." Ma came hurrying to the door. "What is it, Travis?" she wanted to know. "That bull," I pointed. "He's mad with hydrophobia, and he's heading straight for Elizabeth and little Arless." Ma took one look and said, "Oh, my Lord," in almost a whisper. She didn't look and wait to get me my gun or anything else. She just tore out for the creek, hollering for little Arless and Elizabeth to run, to climb a tree, to do anything to get away from that bull. I called after her, telling her to wait, to give me a chance to shoot the bull. I don't guess she ever heard me, but the bull heard her. He tried to turn on her, stumbled and went to his knees, and then he was back on his feet again as Ma went flying past, and he charged straight for her. He'd have gotten her, too, only the sickness had his legs too wobbly. And this time, when he fell, he rooted his nose into the ground and just lay there moaning, too weak to even try and get up again. By this time, old Yeller was there, baying at the bull, keeping out of his reach, but ready to eat him alive if he ever came to his feet again. I didn't wait to see any more. I went and got my gun. I hobbled down to where I couldn't miss and shot that roan bull between the eyes. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. We couldn't leave the dead bull to lay there that close to the cabin. In a few days, the scent of rotten flesh would drive us out. Also, the carcass lay too close to the spring. Ma was afraid it would foul up our drinking water.
"We'll have to try and drag it further from the cabin and burn it," I said.
"Burn it?" I said in surprise. "Why can't we just leave it for the buzzards and vermin to clean up?"
"Because that might spread the sickness. If the vermins eat it, they might get the sickness as well."
Ma went to put the harness on Jumper, and I sent Elizabeth to bring me a rope. I doubled the rope and tied it in a loop around the bull's horn, and Ma brought Jumper, who snorted and shied away at the sight of the dead animal. Jumper had smelled deer blood plenty of times, so I guess it was the size of the bull that scared him. Or maybe, like Yeller, Jumper could scent the dead bull's sickness. I had to talk mean and threaten him with a club before we could get him close enough for Ma to hook the single tree over the loop of rope that I tied around the bull's horns. And then the weight of the bull was too much for him. Jumper couldn't drag it. He leaned into his collar and dug in with his hooves, and he grunted and strained, and he pulled till I saw the big muscles of his haunches flatten and start quivering. But the best he could do was slide the bull carcass across the ground about a foot before he gave up. I knew he wasn't throwing off. Jumper was full of a lot of pesky, aggravating mule tricks, but when you called him to move a load, he'd move it or bust something. Well, I called on him again, and I drove him at a different angle from the load, hoping he'd have better luck. He didn't. He threw everything he had into the collar, and all he did was pop a link out of his right trace chain. That flying link whistled past my ear with the speed of a bullet. It would have killed me just as dead as if it hit me. Well, that was it. There was no moving the dead bull now. We could patch up that broken trace chain for pulling an ordinary load, but it would never be strong enough to pull this one, even if Jumper was. I looked at Ma, and she shook her head.
Well, I guess there's nothing we can do but burn it right here. But it's going to take a sight of wood gathering.
It did, too. We'd lived there long enough to use up all the dead wood that was close to the cabin. Now Ma and Elizabeth had to go way out in the brush for it. I got a piece of rawhide string and patched up that trace chain, and Ma and Elizabeth used Jumper to drag up big dead logs, and I helped them pile the logs on top of the bull. We piled them up there till we had the carcass completely covered, and then set fire to it. In a little bit, the fire was roaring. Sheets of hot flame shot high into the air. The heat and the stench of burned hair and scorched hide drove us back. It was the biggest fire I'd ever seen. I thought there was a fire enough there to burn 3 bulls, but when it began to die down a couple hours later, the bull's carcass wasn't half burned up. Ma and Elizabeth went back to dragging more wood. It took 2 days and 2 nights to burn up that bull. We worked all day long each day, with Ma and Elizabeth dragging up the wood and me feeding that stinking fire. Then at night we could hardly sleep. That was because all the howling and snarling and fighting of the wolves lured to the place by the scent of the roasting meat. The wolves didn't get any of it, for they were too afraid of hot fire, but that didn't keep them from gathering for miles around and making the night hideous with their howling and snarling. And all night long, both nights, Old Yeller crippled back and forth between the fire and the bay cabin, baying savagely, warning the wolves to keep away. Both nights I lay there, watching the eyes of the shifting wolves glowing like live mesquite coals in the firelight, listening to the weak moaning bawl of old Spot still traveling in a circle. I lay there, feeling shivery with a fearful dread that brought up pictures in my mind of Bud Searcy's uncle. I sure wished that Pa would come home. As soon as the job of burning the bull was over, Ma told us we had to do the same for Spot Heifer. That was all Ma said about it, but I could tell by the look in her eyes how much she hated to give up. She had had great hopes of Spot making us a real milk cow, especially after Old Yeller had gentled her so fast, but that was all gone now. Ma looked tired and more worried than I think I'd ever seen her. I guess she couldn't help thinking what I was thinking, that if hydrophobia had sickened one of our cows, it might just get them all. I'll do the shooting, I told her, but I'm going to follow her out a ways from the house to do it, closer to some wood. What about your leg? Ma asked. The leg's getting all right, I told her. I think it'll do it some good to be walked on. Well, just try and kill her on bare ground, Ma cautioned. As dry as it is now, we'd be running a risk of setting the woods afire if there was too much old grass around the place. I waited till Spot circled past the cabin again, and then followed with my gun, keeping a safe distance behind. By now, Spot was so sick and starved I could hardly stand to look at her. She didn't look like a cow. She looked more like the skeleton of one. She was just skin and bones, and she was so weak that she stumbled as she walked. A half dozen times she went to her knees, and each time I'd think she'd taken her last step, but she'd always get up and go on again and keep on bawling. I kept waiting for her to cross a bare patch of ground where it'd be safe to build a fire, but she didn't. I couldn't drive her, of course. She was too crazy mad to be driven anywhere, and I was afraid to mess with her. She might be just like the bull. If I ever let her know I was anywhere about, she might go on fighting. I guess she was about a mile from the cabin before I saw that she was about to cross a dry, sandy wash, something like the one where Yeller and I got mixed up with the hogs. That'd be a good place, I knew. It was pretty far for us to have to come burn her, but there was plenty of dry wood around, and if I could drop her out there in that wide, sandy wash, there'd be no danger of fire getting away from us. I hurried around and got ahead of her, and I hid behind a turkey pear bush on the far side of the wash. But as sick and blind as she was, I think I could have stood out in the broad open without her ever seeing me. I waited till she tried stumbling across the sandy bed of the wash, and then fired and dropped her in the middle of it. I'd used up more of my strength than I knew, following Spot so far from the cabin, and by the time I got back I was dead beat. The sweat was pouring off me and I was trembling all over. Ma took one look at me and told me to get to bed.
We'll go start the burning. You stay on that leg any longer, it'll start swelling again.
I didn't argue. I knew I was too weak and tired to take another walk that far without rest. So I told Ma where to find Spot and told her to leave little Arless with me and watched her and Elizabeth head out, both mounted on Jumper. Ma was carrying a pan full of live coals to start the fire with. At the last minute, Yeller got up off his cowhide. He stood watching them for a minute, like he was trying to make up his mind about something, and then he went trotting after them. He was still thin and rough-looking and crippled pretty badly in one leg, but I figured he knew better than I whether or not he was able to travel, and I didn't bother calling him back. As it turned out, it's a good thing I didn't. Only afterwards I wished 1,000 times that I could have some way looking ahead to what was going to happen. Then I would have done everything I could to keep all of them from going. With little Arless to look after, I sure didn't mean to drop off to sleep, but I did, and slept till sundown, when suddenly I jerked awake, feeling guilty for leaving him alone so long. I needn't have worried. Little Arless was right out there in the yard, playing with the speckled pup. They had themselves a game going. Arless was racing round the cabin, dragging a short piece of frayed rope, and the pup was chasing the rope. Now and then he'd get close enough to pounce on it, and then he'd let out a growl and set teeth into it and try and shake it, and hanging on all the time. Generally he got jerked off his feet and turned a couple somersets, but that didn't seem to bother him. The next time Arless went racing past, the pup would tie into the rope again. I wondered if he wouldn't get some of his baby teeth jerked out at such rough play, but guessed it wouldn't do much matter. He'd soon be shedding them anyway. I wondered, too, what was keeping Ma and little Elizabeth so long. And then I thought how far it was to where the dead cow lay, and how long it would take for just the two of them to drag up enough wood and get a fire started, figuring they'd be lucky if they got back before dark. I went off to the spring to get a bucket of fresh water and wondered when Pa would come back. Ma had said a couple days ago that it was about that time, and I hoped so. For one thing, I could hardly wait to see what sort of horse Pa had going to bring me, but Mainly this hydrophobic plague had me scared. I'd handled things pretty well until that came along. Of course, I'd gotten pretty bad hog cut, but that could have happened to anyone, even a grown man. And I was about to get well on that, but if the sickness got more of our cattle, I wouldn't know what to do. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. It wasn't until dark came that I really began to get uneasy about Ma and Elizabeth. Then I could hardly stand it because they hadn't come home, and I knew in my own mind why they hadn't. It had been late when they started out. They had a good long piece to go, and even with wood handy, it took considerable time to drag up enough for the size of fire that they'd need. And I couldn't think of any real danger to them. They weren't far enough away from the cabin to be lost, and if they were, Jumper, he knew his way home. Also, Jumper was gentle, and there wasn't much chance that he'd scare and throw them off. On top of all that, they had Old Yeller along. Old Yeller might be pretty weak and crippled yet, but he'd protect them from just about anything that might come their way. Still, I was uneasy. I couldn't help the feeling that something was wrong. I'd have gone and see about them if it hadn't been for little Arless. It was past his supper time, and he was getting hungry and sleepy and fussy. I took him and the speckled pup inside the kitchen and lit a candle, and I settled them on the floor and gave them each a bowl of sweet milk, into which I crumbled some cold cornbread. In a little bit, both were eating out of the same bowl, and little Arliss knew better than that, and I ought to have paddled him for doing it. But I didn't. I didn't say a word. I was too worried. I just about made my mind to put little Arliss and the pup to bed and go see for Ma and little Elizabeth when I heard a sound that took me to the door in a hurry. It was a sound of dogs fighting. The sound came from way back there in the dark, but the minute I stepped outside, I could tell the fight was moving towards the cabin. Also, I recognized the voice of Old Yeller. In sort of a raging yell he let out when he was in a sort of fight to a finish. It was the same savage roaring and snarling and squalling he had done the day that he fought those killer hogs off me, and the sound of it chilled my blood. I stood, rooted to the ground, trying to think what I could do, and what I ought to do. And then I heard Jumper snorting keenly and Ma calling in a frightened voice, "Travis! Travis, make a light, son! Get your gun! Hurry!" Well, I came alive then, and I hollered back to her and let her know that I'd heard, and I ran into the cabin and got my gun. I couldn't think at first what could make the sort of light I'd need, and then recollected a clump of bear grass that Ma had recently grubbed out, where she had planned to start a new fall garden. Bear grass has an oily sap that makes it burn bright and fierce for a long time. A pile of it burning would be a big light. I ran, snatched up 4 bundles of half-dried bear grass. The sharp ends of the stiff blades stabbed and stung my arms and chest as I grabbed them up, but I had no time to bother about that. I ran and dumped the bunches of piles into the bare ground outside the yard fence, and then hurried to bring a live coal from the fireplace to start them burning. I fanned fast with my hat. The bear grass blades started smoking, giving off their foul smell. A little flame flickered and started, and wavered for a moment, and then bloomed suddenly and leapt high with a roar. I jumped back, gun held ready, and caught my first glimpse of the screaming, howling fight that came wheeling into the circle of light. It was Old Yeller, all right, tangled with some animal as big and savage as he was. Ma called from outside the light's rim, "Careful, son, and take close aim. It's a big loafer wolf. It's gone mad." My heart nearly quit on me. There weren't many gray loafer wolves in our part of the country, but I knew about them. They were big and savage enough to hamstring a horse or drag down a full-grown cow, and here was Old Yeller, weak and crippled, trying to fight a mad one. I brought up my gun, and then held fire while I hollered at Ma. "Y'all get in the cabin. I'm scared to shoot till I know that you're out of line of fire." I heard Ma whack Jumper with a stick to make him go, and I heard Jumper snort and the clatter of his hoofs as he went galloping in a wide circle to come up behind the cabin. But even after Ma called from the door behind me, I still couldn't fire, not without taking a chance at killing Old Yeller. I waited, my nerves on edge, while Old Yeller and the big wolf fought there in the firelight, whirling and leaping and snarling, slashing, their bared fangs gleaming white, their eyes burning green in the half light. Then they went down in a tumbling roll that stopped with the big wolf on top, his huge jaws shut tight upon Yeller's throat. And that was my chance, and one that I'd better make good. As weak as Old Yeller was, he'd never break that throat hold. There, in the wavering light, I couldn't get a true bead on the wolf. I couldn't see my sights well enough. All I could do was guess aim and hope for a hit. I squeezed the trigger. The gun stock slammed back into my shoulder, and such a long streak of fire spouted from the gun barrel that it blinded me for a second, and I couldn't see a thing. Then I realized that all the growling and snarling had hushed, and a second later I was running towards the two still gray forms laying side by side. For a second, I just knew that I'd killed Old Yeller. Then, about the time I bent over him, he heaved a big sort of a sigh and struggled up to start licking at my hands and wagging his stump tail. I was so relieved that it seemed that all the strength went out of me, and I slumped to the ground and was sitting there shivering when Ma came out and sat down beside me. She put one arm across my shoulders and held it there while she told me what had happened. Like I'd figured, it had taken her and Elizabeth till dark to get the wood gathered up and the fire to get going around the dead cow. Then they'd mounted Old Jumper and were heading for home. They'd been without water all this time and were thirsty, and when they came to the crossing on Birdsong Creek, they dismounted to get a drink, and while they were laying there drinking, the wolf came. He was right on them before they knew it. Ma happened to look up and seen the dark hulk of him come bounding towards them across a small clearing. He was snarling as he came, and Ma just barely had time to come to her feet and grab up a dead chinaberry pole before he sprang. And she whacked him hard across the head, knocking him to the ground, and Old Yeller was there tying into him. Ma and Elizabeth got back on Jumper and tore out for the house, and right after them came the wolf, like he had his mind fixed on catching them and nothing else. But Old Yeller fought him too hard and too fast. Yeller wasn't big and strong enough to stop him, but he kept slowing him down and fought away from Jumper and Ma and Elizabeth.
He had to have been mad, son, Ma wound up. You know that no wolf in his right senses would act that way. Not even a big loafer wolf.
Yes'm, and it's sure a good thing that Old Yeller was along there to fight him off. I shuddered at the thought of what would have happened without Old Yeller. Ma waited a little bit, and then said in a quiet voice,
"It's a good thing for us, son, but it wasn't good for Old Yeller."
The way she said that gave me a cold feeling in the pit of my stomach. I sat up straighter.
"What do you mean? Old Yeller's all right. He's maybe chewed up some, but he can't be hurt too bad. See, he done trotted off towards the house."
Then it hit me what Ma was getting at, and all my insides froze, and I couldn't get my breath. I jumped to my feet, wild with hurt and scare.
"But Ma, Old Yeller just saved your life. He saved my life. He saved little Arless' life. We can't—"
Ma got up and put her arm across my shoulders again.
"I know, son, but he's been bitten by the mad wolf."
I started off into the darkness of the night, while my mind whirled and darted this way and that, like a scared rat trying to find its way out of a loop.
But, Ma, we don't know for certain. We could wait and see. We could tie him up or shut him up in the corn crib or some place till we know for sure.
Ma broke down and went to crying then. She put her head on my shoulder and held me so tight that she nearly choked off my breath.
We can't take a chance, son. It would be you or me or little Arless or Elizabeth next. I'll shoot him if you can't, but either way, we gotta do it. We can't take that chance.
Well, it come clear to me that Ma was right. We can't take that kind of a risk. And from everything I'd heard, I knew that there was very little chance of Old Yeller's escaping the sickness. It was going to kill something inside me to do it. But I knew then that I had to shoot my big yeller dog. Once I knew for sure I had it to do, I didn't think I ever felt anything. I just kind of went numb all over like a dead man walking. Quickly I left Ma and went to stand in the light of the burning bare grass. I reloaded my gun and called Old Yeller back from the house. I stuck the muzzle of the gun against his head and pulled the trigger. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. Days went by, and I couldn't seem to get over it. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't cry. I was all empty inside, just hurting. Hurting worse than I ever hurt in my life. Hurting with a sickness that didn't seem to have any cure. Thinking every minute of my big yeller dog, how we'd worked together and romped together, how he had fought the she-bear off little Arless, and how he had saved me from the killer hogs, and how he had fought that mad wolf off Ma and Elizabeth. Thinking that all over, I'd had to shoot him, the same as I'd done that bull and the spot heifer. Ma tried to talk to me about it, and I let her. But while everything she said made sense, it didn't do a thing to the dead feeling I had. Elizabeth talked to me. She didn't say much, but she was too shy. But she pointed out that I had another dog, the speckled pup.
He's part Old Yeller, and he was the best one of the bunch.
But that didn't help either. The speckled pup might be part Old Yeller, but he wasn't Old Yeller. He hadn't saved all of our lives and then been shot down like he was nothing. And then one night it clouded up and rained till daylight, and that seemed to wash away the hydrophobic plague. At least, pretty soon afterwards, it seemed to die out completely. But we didn't know that then. What seemed important to us about the rain was that the next morning after it fell, Pa came riding home through the mud. The long ride to Kansas and back had Pa drawn down till he was thin and knotty as a fence rail. But he had money in his pockets, a big shouting laugh for everyone, and a saddle horse for me. The horse was a cat stepping blue roan with a black mane and tail. Pa put me on him the first thing and made me gallop him to the clearing around the house. The roan had all the pride and fire any grown man would want in his best horse, and yet was as gentle as a pet. "Now ain't he a dandy?" Pa said. Yes, sir. And I knew that Pa was right, and that I ought to be proud and thankful, but I wasn't. I didn't feel one way or another about the horse. Pa saw that something was wrong, and I saw him give a questioning look at Ma, and Ma shake her head. And then late that evening, just before supper, he called me down to the spring where we sat and we talked. "Your Ma told me about the dog," he said. Yes, sir, but I didn't add anything else. "That was rough," he said. That was as rough as a thing I ever heard tell of happening to a boy, and I'm mighty proud to learn how my boy has stood up to it. I couldn't ask any more of a grown man. He stopped for a minute, picked up some little pebbles, and thumped them into the water, scattering a bunch of hairy-legged water bugs. The bugs darted across the water in all directions. Now the thing to do, he went on, is just try and forget it and go on being a man.
How? How can you forget a thing like that?
He studied me for a moment, then shook his head. I guess I don't quite mean it like that, he said. It's not a thing you can forget. I don't guess it's a thing that you ought to forget. What I mean is, things like that happen. They might seem pretty cruel and unfair, but that's how life is part of the time. But that wasn't the only way life is, though. A part of the time, it's pretty good. And a man can't afford to waste all the good part worrying about the bad parts. If you do that, it will make all the things bad. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes, sir, I said, and I did understand. Only it still didn't do me any good. I still felt just dead and empty. Well, that went on for a week or better, I guess, before a thing happened that brought me alive again. It was right at dinner time. Pa had sent me out to the lot to feed Jumper and the horses. I had just started back when I heard a commotion in the house, and I heard Ma's voice lift high and sharp. "Why, you thieving little whelp!" she cried out, and then I heard a shrieking yelp, and out the kitchen door came that speckled pup with a huge chunk of cornbread clutched in his mouth. And he raced round the house, running with his tail clamped, and he was a-yelling and a-squalling like someone was beating him to death. But that still didn't keep him from hanging on to that piece of cornbread that he had stolen from Ma. Inside the house, I heard little Arless. He was fighting and screaming his fool head off at Ma for hitting his dog, and above it all, I could hear Pa's roaring laughter. Right then, I began to feel a little better. Sight of that little old pup tearing out for the brush with that piece of cornbread, it seemed to loosen something inside me. I felt better all day. I went back and rode my horse, and I enjoyed it. I rode way off into the brush, not going anywhere specially, just riding and looking, and beginning to feel proud of owning my own horse. Then, along around sundown, I rode down to Birdsong Creek, heading for the house, and up on the spring I heard a splashing and a hollering, and I looked ahead, and sure enough, it was little Arless. He was stripped naked and romping in our drinking water again, and right in there romping with him was that bread-stealing speckled pup. Well, I started to holler at them. I started to say, "Arless, you get that nasty old pup out of our drinking water." And then I didn't. Instead, I went to laughing, and I sat there and laughed until I cried, when all the time I knew that I ought to go beat them to a frazzle for messing up our drinking water. When finally I couldn't laugh or cry another bit, I rode on up to the lot and turned my horse in. Tomorrow, I thought, I'll take Arless and that pup out for a squirrel hunt. That pup is still mighty little, but the way I figure it, if he's big enough to act like Old Yeller, he's big enough to start learning to earn his keep. End of chapter 16. End of Old Yeller.